Hi, everybody. Tonight, I invite you to drift with me into the candlelit halls and hidden chambers of a world that now exists only in echoes and stone, where kings and queens, princes and princesses, courtiers and cooks all lived lives so strange and peculiar that even the most lavish tales barely capture the truth. This is the weird life of royalty in medieval times. A slow, winding journey through secrets, rituals, feasts, and follies that once ruled entire kingdoms. So settle into your pillows, let your mind grow soft and drowsy, and follow me back through the creaking gates of history, where the flicker of a torch might reveal wonders, or whisper of shadows best left to dreams. Our story begins in the chill of an early spring morning, in a place that might have been anywhere in Europe, perhaps England or France or the misty highlands of Scotland, where castles rise from rolling hills like the crowns of sleeping giants. In such a keep, of stone so thick that the voices within echoed back upon themselves, lived a young prince named Alaric. He was neither the handsomest nor the bravest yet, but he was curious, dangerously so for someone born to wear a crown. At dawn, when the rooster's cry was still muffled by the fog, Alaric would slip from his heavy bed, its blankets stiff with embroidery and its posts draped in silks. He would ease open the carved oak door that groaned like an old man every time it moved. Sometimes his feet padded silently across the cold flagstones to the kitchens, where the warmth of the ovens made a small paradise compared to the draughty corridors of the royal wing. It was here, among flour-dusted cooks and copper pots polished bright as the sun, that Alaric first learned how different his life was meant to be. The cooks called him Milord, though they whispered other names when they thought he did not hear. Little Ghost, Shadow Prince. They knew he should not have been there, with his hands sticky with dough, or his nose buried in baskets of herbs meant for grander tables. But Alaric loved the stories the cooks told more than the stiff lectures of his tutors. Stories of old kings who drank spiced wine until dawn, of queens who bathed in goat's milk to keep their skin like marble, of royal children who never touched the ground for fear the earth would claim them too soon. It was strange, Alaric thought, how the palace held 1,000 rules for those of his blood. Rules about when to speak, how to bow, what to wear for supper. But behind the kitchen door, none of that mattered. Here, the cooks talked of spirits in the larder and mice that carried crumbs to hidden chambers where ancient secrets slept. They told him that deep beneath the castle lay tunnels older than the kingdom itself, dug by monks or druids or things with no names left to them. And so it was that Alaric began to dream not of his coronation, but of what lay in the walls beneath his feet. When his father, King Theobald, found out about these adventures, he did not shout. Royal tempers were rarely wasted on yelling. Instead, the king summoned Alaric to the solar, a chamber warm with rush mats and tapestries, smelling faintly of the lavender sachets tucked into corners to mask the damp stone's scent. The king sat in a chair so high-backed it might as well have been a throne. He looked at his son as one might regard an unfamiliar animal, beautiful but unpredictable. "You are a prince," he said, his voice soft and dry, like parchment turned in candlelight. "Princes do not dabble with ovens and stories of spirits. You must learn the weight of your name, or you will drown beneath it." Alaric lowered his eyes to the rushes underfoot, where scraps of old feasts sometimes fell and were ground to dust by velvet shoes. He did not argue. He knew better than that. But in his chest, his heart kept pounding out its restless song. He did not want to be only the prince they paraded before ambassadors. He wanted to see the secret world the cooks spoke of. He wanted to find the hidden doorways in the walls, to slip through like a mouse and listen to what the castle whispered when the torches burned low. His tutor, Master Edwin, was tasked with straightening the boy's curiosity into proper lines. Edwin was a thin man whose eyebrows seemed determined to meet in the middle of his brow. His lessons were long and droning. Latin declensions, the genealogies of long-dead barons, the art of speaking without saying anything at all. Alaric sat at a great oak table, quill scratching, ink smudging his fingers, pretending to listen as the sun inched its way across the slits of the arrow loops. Sometimes he wondered if the stones themselves remembered more than he did, if perhaps they stored the laughter and tears of all who had leaned against them. But night was Alaric's true kingdom. After the last candle in the chapel guttered out, after the servant's steps faded into nothingness, he would creep from his bed once more. Sometimes he took a single tallow candle. Sometimes he walked in darkness, guided only by the memory of the walls beneath his fingertips. The castle changed at night. Corridors that seemed straight in daylight twisted in odd ways. Doors led to storerooms that looked like chapels. Stairways ended in blank stone or opened onto secret gardens choked with moonlit vines. One night, beneath the hum of the wind rattling the shutters, Alaric found it. A small door, half hidden behind a moth-eaten tapestry of a saint whose name had been forgotten by all but the mice. The door was so low he had to bend nearly double to slip through. On the other side was a passage so narrow his shoulders brushed stone on either side. He walked for what felt like hours, candle guttering, heart thudding with the thrill of being nowhere he was supposed to be. When at last he emerged, it was into a chamber that smelled of old books and older secrets. Shelves sagged under the weight of scrolls tied in fading ribbons. A table lay beneath a drape of dust, upon which sat an hourglass taller than any Alaric had ever seen, its sands still trickling, slow and silent. Above him, the ceiling was a dome of painted stars, their gold leaf dulled but still glinting in the candle's trembling glow. He did not know then what this place was, nor who had built it. He knew only that it was his alone, and that if the royal life above was bound by rules, perhaps here, beneath the castle's beating heart, he could craft a different life. One not quite royal, not quite servant, but something stranger still. And so, with a mind full of questions and pockets full of stolen pastries, Prince Alaric's secret kingdom was born, one that would shape not only his nights, but the very course of the realm above. But that, my dear dreamer, is a secret we shall explore together, by slow candlelight, on another night's gentle telling. In the days that followed, Prince Alaric found his thoughts drifting ever away from the golden halls and toward the hidden chamber beneath the stone. Each lesson with Master Edwin became an exercise in concealment, his eyes dutifully fixed on the parchment before him, yet his mind roamed corridors unseen by any tutor's gaze. He dreamed awake of the painted dome and its cold constellations, of the hourglass with its sands whispering secrets of time unbound by crowns or courts. Each night, when the hush of the castle settled over the battlements like a thick woolen cloak, Alaric slipped from his bed once more. He learned to oil the hinges of the tapestry door so it would not betray him with a squeal. He brought candles, pilfered from the sacristy, their wax dripped down his sleeves like secret scars. He carried bread rolls hidden in his sleeves, and sometimes apples filched from the baskets in the buttery. In that place of dust and quiet, he built himself a refuge. By the wavering glow of his flame, he explored every shelf and crevice. He unrolled brittle scrolls, though many were written in hand so ancient they seemed more art than word. Some were records of crops and tithes, some letters with seals so cracked they fell away at his touch. But deeper in the stacks, hidden beneath layers of discarded cloth, he found stranger relics. Fragments of maps that charted not lands but tunnels, etched with symbols that looked half runic, half holy. There were parchments inked in a language he did not know, though the curves and thorns of its letters stirred something restless in him. One night, as the castle slumbered above, Alaric discovered a small chest banded in iron. Its lock had rusted away, so when he pressed upon it, the lid gave with a reluctant sigh. Inside lay a single object, a circlet of tarnished silver, its surface engraved with tiny creatures, dragons, serpents, stags leaping over trees so finely wrought that he could swear they moved when the candle flickered. He lifted it free, feeling the cold bite of the metal. It was far too small for his head, perhaps a child's crown, or a relic of a faith no longer worshipped within these walls. He set it gently upon the table beside the hourglass and watched how the candlelight danced across its beasts. He wondered whose brow it had once touched. Had it crowned a prince like him, curious, restless, awake while all the world slept? Or had it marked someone the kings had feared, a reminder that the blood in these stones ran thicker and older than any family's claim? In the days that followed, Alaric carried the image of that circlet in his mind as he sat beside his father at the feasting table. He watched the way the courtiers bent at the waist, the way the servants held their breath when the king's cup ran dry. He noted how the bishop's rings glinted like small suns whenever he raised his hand in blessing or in warning. He saw the way his mother, Queen Isolde, drifted through the hall like a ghost stitched into velvet, her eyes never quite meeting his own. One evening, a feast was called in honor of visiting nobles from a neighboring realm, lords whose banners bore beasts stitched in gold, whose ladies wore veils so sheer they seemed spun of mist. Alaric sat at the king's right hand, his chair high, his shoulders wrapped in a mantle heavy with ermine. He sipped at wine too strong for his tongue, forcing himself to swallow its burn while his mind slipped back down the hidden stairway beneath the tapestry into the dust and secrets of his underground sanctuary. As minstrels plucked their lutes and jongleurs spun clumsy cartwheels across the rush-strewn floor, Alaric's gaze drifted to the shadows beyond the torchlight. He thought of the kitchens, where the cooks told stories with buttered fingers and knowing winks. He thought of the narrow passage behind the tapestry and wondered if, even now, the circlet waited for him, its engraved creatures pacing restlessly within the metal. His father's voice cut through his drifting thoughts. A single word, sharp as a thrown knife. Alaric. He snapped to attention, the hall suddenly too bright, too loud. "You have not heard a word the Duke has said," King Theobald murmured, his smile wide enough for the watching guests but brittle at its edges. "Perhaps you would share with us your thoughts on the arrangement proposed?" Alaric's throat tightened. He looked at the Duke, a wide man with a beard like a fox's brush, and then at his father's hand, resting near the hilt of his ceremonial dagger. He opened his mouth, a dozen phrases from Master Edwin's lessons tumbling over one another in his mind, none of them quite fitting the shape of the truth that sat heavy in his chest. "I think," Alaric began, his voice softer than he wished, "I think any arrangement must first be weighed against the cost to our people." The Duke's brow furrowed. King Theobald's hand twitched, a small gesture, but enough to send a ripple through the hall. The courtiers turned their eyes to their goblets. The minstrels found new vigor in their strings. Queen Isolde's lips pressed together, a pale crescent on her still face. "Spoken like a true prince," the king said at last, the smile returning with the sharpness of a drawn blade. He lifted his goblet in toast, but the chill that settled on Alaric's neck did not ease. Later, when the hall emptied of music and laughter and the embers in the hearth sank to whispers of ash, Alaric lay wakeful beneath his embroidered canopy. The echoes of the feast clung to him, his father's icy smile, the courtiers' veiled glances, the cloying taste of spiced wine still ghosting his tongue. So he rose once more, feet silent on the rushes, hands deft as any thief's. He slipped from his chamber, past the dozing guards, past the flicker of dying torches, down the turning stair until the hidden door welcomed him like an old friend. The passage closed behind him, sealing him away from crowns and feasts and bargains struck in candlelight. In the secret chamber, he placed the circlet upon his brow. It sat askew, slipping down over one eye, but he did not care. He traced the dragons and stags with the tip of his finger, imagining their silver dance beneath a sky free of banners and treaties. In that moment, beneath the painted stars of the forgotten dome, Alaric felt like something more than a prince, something older, wilder, unclaimed. There, in the hush of stone and dust, he dreamed not of thrones, but of tunnels yet to be explored, of secrets that waited in the dark, restless and patient, eager for the touch of a curious boy's hand. The nights grew longer as spring slipped quietly toward summer, each dusk a little softer, each dawn a little more reluctant to break the spell of darkness. By day, the castle hummed with talk of harvests and treaties, of threats at the border, and nobles who must be flattered or silenced. But beneath all this careful order, Prince Alaric's secret realm spread its quiet roots deeper and deeper into the marrow of the stone. Word of the prince's restlessness spread, though no one dared speak of it openly. Servants traded glances when they found a candle stub tucked behind a tapestry, or footprints in the dust where no one should walk. Master Edwin noticed the ink smudges beneath Alaric's eyes, the small tremor in his hand as he held his quill. The queen, drifting pale as ever through the chapel and the gardens, would sometimes pause to rest her hand on her son's shoulder, her touch light like the brush of silk. She asked no questions. If she guessed where he went, she did not say. By the warmth of June's first breath, Alaric knew every crack and curve of his hidden chamber, yet its secrets only multiplied the deeper he looked. One night, while tracing a pattern on the hourglass's base, his finger caught on a small notch in the wood, an almost invisible catch, smoothed by time. With a breath held tight in his throat, he pressed it. A panel slid aside with a reluctant sigh, revealing a hollow no bigger than a bread box. Inside lay scraps of parchment, bound by a ribbon that crumbled at his touch. He carried the fragile bundle to the table, careful not to disturb the circlet that still rested there like a silent guardian. By the wavering flame, he unrolled each scrap. Some were letters, half-finished thoughts penned in a hand sharp and fluid, signed only with an initial that meant nothing to him yet, L. Others were pages torn from a journal, lines scribbled in haste, full of warnings and half-mad riddles. The serpent coils where the stag falls. The crown above all crowns is hidden beneath the roots that do not grow. To find the heart, find the well. To find the well, follow the breath of stone. He read the words again and again, committing them to memory even as they tangled into dreams that left him waking with a start. Who had written them? What well? What breath of stone? The castle was alive with breath, wind moaning through arrow slits, walls that seemed to exhale the cold of the earth at night. He could feel it now, here in this hidden belly, as if the stones themselves whispered secrets through his bones. One night, restless with questions that no lesson could answer, Alaric returned to the kitchens. He had not dared go there since his father's warning, but the pull was too strong. He found old Swithin by the hearth, a cook whose back was as bowed as the beams overhead, eyes bright despite the cataract that glazed one like a pearl. Swithin did not startle when the prince stepped from the shadows. He simply wiped his hands on his apron and poured a mug of small beer, setting it on the table as if this midnight visit were the most natural thing in the world. "You've been down there, haven't you?" Swithin rasped, voice rough with years of breathing in smoke and flour dust. Alaric froze, the mug halfway to his lips. "Down where?" Swithin gave a soft chuckle, more sigh than laugh. "Don't play the fox with me, boy. There's tunnels older than your father's crown, older than any crown that ever sat heavy on a man's skull. Folk forget, but the stones remember." Alaric leaned in, the heat of the hearth battling the chill that crept up from the memory of that secret chamber. "Who built them? What lies at the end?" Swithin shrugged, poking at the embers with a blackened iron rod. Sparks leapt like fireflies. "Monks, some say. Druids, others. Spirits, if you ask the old women who still hang rowan above their door lintels. As for what lies at the end..." He glanced at the prince then, one eye clouded, the other sharp as a whetted knife. "That's the part no one ever comes back to tell." He reached beneath the chopping table and brought out a small loaf, still warm, the crust cracked just so. He pressed it into Alaric's hands. "If you go deeper, you best not go hungry, or alone." Alaric wanted to ask 100 things. About the riddles, about the well, about the breath of stone, but Swithin turned away, shoulders bent, as if the conversation had drifted off like smoke through the chimney. So the prince tucked the loaf into the fold of his mantle and slipped back into the hush of the corridors, the taste of questions bitter and sweet on his tongue. That night, back beneath the painted stars, Alaric held the loaf in one hand and the old parchments in the other. He traced the lines again, whispering them aloud, letting the echo bounce from stone to stone. To find the heart, find the well. To find the well, follow the breath of stone. He pressed his ear to the cold wall, closing his eyes. For a long moment, there was nothing, just the hush of his own breath, the slow pulse in his temples. Then, faint but clear, he felt it, a drift of air against his cheek, cooler than the chamber's stale hush. He rose, candle trembling in his grasp, and began to follow the faint exhale that seemed to sigh from the cracks where stone met stone. He moved slowly, one hand on the rough wall, the other shielding his flame. The passage narrowed, then widened, then bent upon itself in strange angles that defied the logic of any hallway above. At last, the tunnel spilled into a small chamber he had never seen, a round space where the air smelled of wet earth and iron. At its center, half buried in the dirt floor, lay a circle of stones ringed with moss and old chalk marks that crumbled when his foot brushed them. A well, or what had once been one. He knelt beside it, peering into the darkness. The candle's light danced on the stones, but vanished down the throat of the hole. He dropped a small crumb of bread, listening for a splash or a thud. Nothing came back but silence. In that silence, Prince Alaric felt a thrill coil through him. Fear and wonder tangled so tightly he could not pull them apart. He was no longer only the king's heir or the restless boy who stole pastries from the buttery. He was a seeker now, a listener for secrets the walls had kept safe for centuries. Above him, the castle slept on, blind to the heartbeat quickening beneath its ancient stones. But Alaric did not sleep. He leaned closer to the well's dark mouth and thought he heard it. A sigh, a whisper, or perhaps only the echo of his own breath, an invitation to go deeper still. The dawn that followed found Prince Alaric wrapped in his cloak, curled in the hidden chamber beside the well's mouth, his candle burned to a stub between cold fingers. He had not slept, not truly, but drifted instead in that half-realm where dreams seep through the thin skin of wakefulness. In those moments between the beat of his heart, he heard voices that were not voices, just the hush of stone remembering things that flesh had long forgotten. When the first pale spill of daylight crept into the world above, Alaric rose, bones stiff from the chill that pooled around the old stones. He smoothed the parchments, now fragile as the wings of dead moths, and tucked them into a hollow behind the hourglass. He placed the silver circlet atop them as though it were a seal or a promise, one only he could understand. Slipping back into his chamber before the household stirred had become its own small art. He moved lightly past guards who slumped at their posts, past servants bustling to light fires and lay out the first bread and ale of the day. His bed waited for him, sheets still warm from where he'd slipped out hours before. He slid beneath them, eyes closing just as his valet entered to throw wide the shutters and announce the morning with a voice that cracked like an old bell. That day, the castle teemed with life. A party of merchants had arrived from the coast, bearing bolts of silk and spices packed in tight barrels. The great hall filled with the scent of cloves and the sharp sweetness of oranges, treasures rare enough to make even the king's grim face ease into something like satisfaction. Alaric sat beside him on the high dais, hands folded, mind far away from the chatter of trade and tariffs. When the audience was done, Master Edwin cornered him in the corridor outside the solar. His fingers pinched Alaric's sleeve like talons clutching prey. "Your attention, your highness, wanders dangerously. This is not the time for dreams." Alaric, who had grown so accustomed to hiding his thoughts, let his face settle into the blank mask he wore for feasts and councils. "Forgive me, master." The air was close in the hall. Edwin's eyes, dark beneath the press of his brows, narrowed. "You are your father's only heir. Remember that. A crown must weigh upon the brow long before it ever rests there." He wanted to laugh at Edwin's earnest fear, at the thought of the hidden circlet buried far below, a crown of beasts and secrets instead of velvet and gold. But he only bowed his head, murmured something polite, and slipped free the moment Edwin turned to lecture a page boy who had dropped a sheaf of accounts. Outside, the sun shone like a blessing upon the courtyard. Alaric stood for a moment by the great fountain where a stone lion spewed a constant trickle of water. He watched the droplets glitter and fall, watched the pigeons gather to drink at its base. Around him, knights practiced their swordplay, the ring of steel sharp and bright in the morning air. Children of the servants played at duels with sticks and shouted each other's names as though they were heroes of old ballads. He wondered if they ever slipped through hidden doors at night. If any of them knew that the castle's heart beat deeper than any king's command. That evening, when the candles burned low and the final prayers drifted from the chapel's cold mouth, Alaric returned to his passageway. He moved faster now. His feet knew each stone by touch, his hands found every notch and turn without thought. He carried a rope this time, coiled tight around his shoulder, a stout candle and a lantern to guard it from drafts. Before the well he knelt again, peering into its black throat. He dropped a small pebble and counted. 1, 2, 3, then nothing. No splash, no thud, just the same hush that seemed to say, "Come." He tied the rope to a ring of iron embedded in the chamber wall, a relic of some old purpose he could only guess at, and tested its hold with careful hands. When he was certain it would bear him, he lowered the lantern first, watching its circle of light slide down the rough stones until it vanished into shadow. Then he slipped over the edge, breath held tight, as the well's damp air rose to greet him. Down he went, feet braced against the slippery stones, rope rasping softly in the dark. His lantern swung below like a tiny sun lost in a black sea. The air grew colder the deeper he sank. Water beaded on his brow, dripped from his hair. He felt the walls close tighter, as if the castle's bones wished to swallow him whole. At last, his boots struck earth, a soft, damp floor that sucked at his soles. He lowered himself beside the lantern, lifting it high. Its glow found not water, but a tunnel, rough-hewn and sloping downward into an arch barely taller than a man. Moss and roots clung to its ceiling like fingers reaching down to brush his hair. He hesitated, listening. The tunnel seemed to breathe, an exhale of cold air carrying the scent of something deeper than the castle above, older than its oldest stone. Alaric thought of the riddles again. To find the heart, find the well. To find the well, follow the breath of stone. He stepped forward, lantern high, each footfall stirring the stale air into tiny eddies. The tunnel bent and dipped, its walls slick with a film of moisture. Now and then he glimpsed markings. Scratches? Symbols half buried in moss and lichen. Some looked like letters, others like animals curling into themselves, caught forever mid-pounce or coil. Deeper he went, until the last echoes of the well's mouth faded behind him. There was only the hiss of the lantern flame and the soft drip of water from the tunnel's ceiling. His heart drummed in his chest like a war drum muffled by velvet. At a bend where the tunnel widened into a small hollow, he paused. There, in the circle of his light, lay an old wooden beam set across a fissure in the floor. Beneath it, a crack yawned open, wide enough for a man to fall through if he were careless. Carved into the beam were more symbols, tiny creatures like those on the silver circlet. He ran his thumb over them, feeling their grooves. Dragons, serpents, stags, all dancing in a ring. He sat on his heels, the lantern flickering beside him, and closed his eyes. For a moment, he felt again the pull of the castle above. His father's voice, Edwin's sharp lessons, the watchful gaze of servants who bowed but never spoke the truth. And yet here, in the hush of stone and roots, he felt freer than he ever did at any royal feast. With a deep breath, Alaric rose. He stepped over the fissure, leaving behind the last echo of the world above. Ahead lay only the breath of the earth, and whatever waited in its deepest, oldest heart. The passage beyond the fissure seemed to swallow the light of Alaric's lantern almost hungrily, as if it had waited centuries for a flame to taste again. The air here pressed closer to his skin, thick with the smell of wet stone and something older, a faint tang like iron, or perhaps the memory of blood long dried. He paused, steadying his breath, listening for the drip of water or the skitter of unseen creatures, but the hush was so complete it made his own heartbeat sound deafening. He moved carefully now, mindful of the slickness beneath his boots and the way roots coiled down from the ceiling, sometimes brushing his hair like cold fingers. The tunnel dipped lower, bending in ways no builder of the king's masons would have ever carved. This was older work, older than the keep, older perhaps than the stories the cooks whispered when the fires burned low. Every few steps, he found marks on the walls, scratches that looked too deliberate to be chance, spirals etched into the stone's damp skin. He traced one with his fingertip and felt a shiver crawl up his arm, though the groove was shallow and harmless beneath the pad of his finger. What hands had carved them? What purpose did they serve, buried so far beneath a world that knew nothing of their silent vigil? His lantern flickered, its flame dancing in the stale air. He sheltered it with his hand and pressed on, the small circle of light his only tether to the world of warmth and voices above. In that hush, he thought of the great hall with its blazing hearths and the roar of lords toasting each other's lies. He thought of his mother's pale face, eyes downcast as if reading secrets in the pattern of the rushes beneath her feet. He thought of old Swithin's voice. If you go deeper, you best not go hungry, or alone. And yet alone he was, by choice or fate. After what felt like hours, the tunnel widened abruptly into a chamber that made him catch his breath. Its ceiling rose into a dome, rough but grand, its surface alive with carvings that the lantern's glow only half revealed. Beasts chased each other in frozen hunts across the stone, wolves with eyes like pits, stags crowned with branches, birds with wings spread wide as if mid-flight. Here and there, small runes nestled between the animals, curling like roots or veins beneath skin. In the center of this chamber lay a circle of stones arranged with careful purpose. Within the circle, the earth had sunk into a shallow bowl lined with more of those faint, spiraled marks. Alaric knelt beside it, setting down his lantern so its flame cast shadows that danced along the carved beasts above. He reached out and brushed his fingers through the bowl's hollow. It was dry, but a dampness clung to the stones around its rim, a chill that settled into his bones. He wondered if this was the heart the riddles spoke of, if the breath of stone had guided him true. He thought of the well's mouth far above, the painted stars of his secret chamber, the hourglass whose sands seemed to flow with a mind of their own. How many princes before him had stood here? How many queens or monks or nameless souls who slipped through the cracks of history? He sat back on his heels and closed his eyes. The hush pressed in like a blanket, thick and oddly soothing. He let his thoughts drift to the lines he'd read by candlelight. To find the heart, find the well. To find the well, follow the breath of stone. The words felt alive here, no longer riddles, but instructions whispered by the bones of the castle itself. When he opened his eyes again, he saw something he had missed before. At the far side of the chamber, a narrow archway, half hidden by a tumble of roots that hung like a curtain. He rose, lantern in hand, and pushed through the hanging tangle. The roots brushed against his cheeks, left cool beads of moisture clinging to his skin. Beyond lay another passage, narrower still, but straighter than the winding tunnel behind him. Its walls were smoother, too, as if carved by more careful hands, or perhaps worn down by centuries of passing feet. He followed its length until it bent sharply and opened into a smaller chamber where the air tasted of metal and old earth. Here the walls were lined with niches. In each niche rested something that made his breath catch, small figures carved of stone, each one different. He lifted his lantern higher, squinting at their details. Tiny statues of animals, people, strange beasts that were part man, part something else. Some clutched what looked like offerings, tiny bowls, shards of bone, fragments of cloth long turned to dust. In the center of this second chamber stood an altar of black stone, slick with a sheen that caught the lantern light like water. Upon it lay another circlet, this one of copper, so green with age that it seemed grown from the earth itself. Unlike the delicate silver circlet hidden above, this one was thick, crude, heavy. Its surface bore the same beasts he had seen before, but here they were less graceful, more primal, fangs bared, claws extended, horns twisting like the roots that hid the doorway. Alaric set the lantern beside the altar and reached out. His fingers hovered above the copper crown, close enough to feel the chill it breathed into the air. He did not know why, but he felt he should not touch it, at least not yet. It felt like a thing that demanded something in return, something he did not yet know how to give. Instead, he circled the altar, studying the markings at its base, more spirals, more runes, carved deep into the black stone. Beneath them, a groove ran in a perfect circle around the altar's edge, as if once something had flowed there. Water, perhaps. Or blood. He shivered, though the chamber's air was warm compared to the tunnels he had crossed. He sat on the cold floor, lantern flickering at his side, and leaned back against the wall of stone figures. In their company, he felt oddly less alone. Watched, yes, but not unwelcome. As if they, too, waited for him to puzzle out the path that wound through these secrets, like a thread through a maze. There, in the hush broken only by his own steady breath, Prince Alaric let sleep steal over him at last. The circle of stone beasts, the copper crown, the marks that wove words older than his father's line, all of it sank into his dreams, where tunnels bent into endless spirals, and a voice he almost knew whispered through the hush. Deeper yet, deeper still, when Alaric woke, the lantern's flame had shrunk to a pale flicker, its oil nearly spent. The small statues around him stood silent guard, their carved eyes catching the last of the trembling light. For a moment, he did not know where he was, only that he lay on cold stone, with the copper crown glinting dully in the half-dark, and the weight of the earth pressing down in a hush that felt almost like a lullaby. He pushed himself up, feeling the chill creep into his bones. The chamber smelled of damp moss and something sharper now, a faint tang that made him think of old iron nails left to rust in the rain. He reached for the lantern and coaxed its flame back to life, feeding it the last of his oil. The shadows along the walls leapt higher, flickering over the faces of the stone figures. For a breath, it seemed they shifted, that their tiny hands lifted or turned toward him. But when he blinked, they were still again, patient, watchful, waiting. His eyes fell once more on the copper crown. It sat upon the black altar as if it had grown there, green with the hush of centuries. He remembered how the silver circlet had felt when he placed it on his brow, too small, too delicate, like a toy prince's bauble. But this was no toy. This was a thing that had known darkness, damp earth, the secrets that stones swallow and never yield. He reached out, hesitated, then withdrew his hand. Not yet. The hourglass above, the hidden parchments, the carved riddles, each one a thread pulling him deeper, but they did not yet form a path he could see clearly. He needed to know what they asked of him. Turning from the altar, Alaric lifted the lantern and studied the chamber's walls. The niches seemed to spiral inward, the figures arranged in a pattern that pulled his gaze toward a single stone panel opposite the entrance. Unlike the rough walls, this was smooth, its surface marked by a single carved symbol, a stag, antlers wide as branches, crowned with a star at its brow. He knelt before it, brushing dust and tiny flakes of moss from the carving. Beneath the stag's hooves, faint lines of script curled in a language he almost recognized, letters like the old tongue Edwin made him recite in endless dull hours over brittle scrolls. He mouthed the words slowly, tasting their shape on his tongue. Beneath the crowned heart sleeps the door to the root. Wake it with the blood that binds. He leaned closer, running his fingertip along the shallow groove that circled the stag's base. It reminded him of the channel around the altar, like a conduit for something meant to flow. Blood that binds. The words shivered through him, threading their way through the hush like a draft in a locked room. He sat back on his heels. Was it only a riddle or a demand? Blood. His blood? The thought made his stomach coil, but curiosity burned hotter than fear. He rose, searching the niches again until he found what he half expected. A tiny stone blade, its edge chipped but still keen enough to draw breath from a careless finger. He lifted it carefully. The stone felt warm where the lantern's heat brushed it, its hilt worn smooth by hands long gone. He pressed his thumb to the blade's edge and winced as it pricked his skin. A bead of bright red welled up, but too vivid in the pale glow. Heart fluttering, he stepped back to the panel. He held his thumb above the carved groove, watching the drop swell, tremble, and finally fall. It struck the stone with a soft sound and spread into the groove like ink into parchment. At first, nothing, then a faint tremor beneath his feet. A sigh, deep and slow, as if the stones had drawn in breath after centuries of silence. The stag's carved eyes glinted in the lantern's flicker. Alaric stepped back, clutching the tiny blade, his pulse hammering in his throat. A line cracked open beneath the stag's hooves, hairline at first, then widening with a soft grinding sound. The stone panel trembled, dust drifting from its edges, roots pulling back as if startled from sleep. A seam appeared, growing wider until a doorway yawned open, swallowing the lantern's glow into a darkness blacker than pitch. Alaric stood at its threshold, breath shallow. Behind him, the copper crown waited in the hush of its altar. Ahead lay the opened path, the next coil in this spiral of secrets that had wrapped around his nights, pulling him farther from the boy who sat at his father's feasts and closer to something he could not yet name. He took a step forward, lantern outstretched. The air inside the passage was cold, so cold it made his skin prickle and his breath fog before him. The tunnel beyond was narrower still, walls pressed close as ribs around a heart. His steps echoed back, each footfall swallowed into the hush. Here, the markings returned, spirals, beasts, runes that twisted into one another like vines. The air carried a dampness sharper than before, and beneath it, a scent that stirred something deep in memory. The smell of a storm cellar, earth churned by rain, iron and root tangled together. The passage bent downward, then flattened into a chamber smaller than any before. Its walls were raw earth, lined with rough stones stacked into crude shapes. In the center, a shallow pit ringed with more symbols, more spirals, a mirror of the bowl he had found in the dome above. But here, instead of dry earth, water shimmered at its base, black, still, yet somehow alive with a sheen that caught the lantern's trembling light. Alaric knelt, heart hammering. The air around the pit felt heavy, thick with a silence that made him want to whisper, though he knew no words fit this hush. The crown above all crowns is hidden beneath the roots that do not grow. The riddle flickered in his mind. He stared at the water, his reflection a trembling ghost beneath its dark skin. He could see his face, pale, eyes wide, the mark of the tiny cut on his thumb still bright. He leaned closer, so close the cold breath of the water brushed his lips. For a moment, he thought he saw movement beneath, shadows drifting, shapes half-formed. His pulse stuttered. He wanted to touch it, to break that perfect black mirror, to see what lay beneath. But something in the hush held him back. A warning or a promise? He could not tell which. So he sat beside the pit, lantern guttering, the cold of the chamber seeping through his cloak. Above him, the castle still slept in its stone skin, unaware that its heart was no longer silent. Here, where the breath of stone carried secrets old as roots, Prince Alaric waited, one hand on the earth, one eye on the dark water, listening for the next whisper in this labyrinth of dreams and shadows. The hush of that chamber pressed against Alaric's ribs like a second heartbeat, soft yet insistent, telling him he was not yet done, not yet deep enough in the secrets it had been guarding for so long. The lantern's flame sputtered low, its oil all but spent. Shadows bloomed at the edges of the small pool, stretching into the earthen walls like fingers, curling around the stones stacked like crude sentinels. Alaric sat very still beside the dark water, the cold seeping through his knees and into his bones. He could hear his own breath, ragged from the climb down, and the thrill that pulsed through his veins like some secret wine. Now and then he thought he heard something else too, a faint drip, a shuffle of earth settling deeper, or perhaps the whisper of his own thoughts echoing back at him. He leaned closer to the pool, so near that his breath dimpled its still skin. There, just beneath the wavering reflection of his lantern, he saw them again, shapes moving under the water. It might have been a trick of the flame's dying dance, but the more he stared, the more certain he became that the shadows below were not his own. They drifted slowly, like creatures asleep in deep water, their outlines teasing the edge of shape, horns, antlers, curling tails. He thought of the circlet above, silver beasts frozen mid-leap. He thought of the copper crown waiting on its altar, the harsh snarl of its creatures coiled in tarnished green. The beasts below the water were neither, more fluid, more alive, shifting from one form to another as if they had no single truth to wear. The crown above all crowns is hidden beneath the roots that do not grow. The words pressed at the inside of his skull. He looked up. Roots dangled from the chamber's low ceiling, thick and twisted, but pale, dry, lifeless. They clung to the stones like veins without blood. Alaric rose, lifting his lantern as high as the last flame allowed. The roots did not move, but he could feel them somehow, feel how they drank nothing, how they waited for a drink that never came. A chill stirred at his spine as if the stone beneath him exhaled. He turned back to the pool, crouched beside its edge, and dipped the very tips of his fingers into its surface. The cold struck him like a slap, sharp, biting, so deep it felt like it reached for the marrow in his bones. He almost yanked his hand back, but forced himself to hold it there. Beneath the cold, the shapes flickered away, only to return, drifting nearer to his touch. He drew a breath through clenched teeth and lowered his hand deeper. The water closed around his wrist, numbness crawling up his arm. The hush of the chamber seemed to thicken, filling his ears until the world above. The halls of polished banners, his father's iron voice, Edwin's dry lessons, fell away like a shed skin. Then he felt it, a hardness below the silt, the scrape of something not stone but metal. He curled his fingers around it and tugged. Silt bloomed like ink in the pool, swirling around his wrist. He braced his knees against the cold rim, leaned in deeper. The metal shape resisted, caught on something below the water's hidden throat. He gave it another sharp pull, and with a muffled grind it broke free. He fell back on the chamber floor, clutching the object to his chest, water dripping down his sleeve to pool in the dirt. He scrambled back to the lantern's dying glow and held his prize beneath it. In his hand lay a ring, thicker than any he'd seen at court, forged of dark iron, banded with veins of green that shimmered like moss caught in torchlight. Around its rim, tiny beasts twined in endless chase. A wolf, a serpent, a heart crowned with stars. The same as the circlets. The same as the carvings that led him here. It was too large for his finger, more a band for a wrist, or perhaps a collar for some creature he could not name. Yet as he turned it over, he felt a warmth leaching into his damp palm, a faint pulse that did not belong to the chill water clinging to him. He slid it over his wrist and it settled there, strangely snug despite its size. For a moment he thought he felt it tighten, just a breath, and then it was still. The hush in the chamber changed. Or perhaps it was only him who changed within it. He felt the hush inside his chest now, coiled behind his ribs, where the cold of the pool had left its mark. Alaric looked again at the dry roots above, then at the ring circling his wrist like a captured secret. He pressed his wet palm to the cold earth beside the pool. Beneath his skin, he felt a low thrum, a pulse that matched his own but deeper, slower, older. The roots above him did not twitch, but he thought he saw them glisten, as if dew had begun to gather along their pale lengths. He rose on shaking legs, lantern in one hand, the other clutching his wrist as if to reassure himself that the ring was real, that its weight was not just another riddle in this maze of stone and breath. He knew he could not stay here much longer. The lantern's last flame guttered on the dregs of oil, the hush of the chamber no longer comforting, but heavy with something waiting, listening. So he turned back through the narrow passage, past the cracked doorway beneath the stag's carved hooves. As he stepped into the broader chamber of the altar, the copper crown gleamed at him through the dusk, as if mocking him for what he now carried. He did not touch it. He only bowed his head slightly, an unspoken promise between secrets that shared the same dark cradle. He climbed back through the winding tunnels, feeling each breath of stone as a soft guide beneath his feet. When at last he reached the well's mouth and the rope that would lift him back toward the world of candlelight and whispered prayers, he paused. He looked back once more, down into the dark where the roots waited, where the hush curled like a sleeping serpent. Then he climbed, hand over hand, the ring cold and warm at once, on his wrist, his first true relic of the crown above all crowns, the one that did not glitter in torchlight, but in the hush of places forgotten by kings. And above him, the castle dreamed on, unaware that its youngest prince now carried the breath of its oldest heart back into the waking world. When Alaric emerged once more through the hidden door behind the moth-eaten tapestry, the hush of the tunnels clung to him like a second skin. He paused there, in the narrow passage that led to his secret chamber with its painted stars and hourglass sands, and drew a slow breath, trying to quiet the thrum in his blood. In his wrist, the iron band sat cold yet strangely alive, like an ember cupped in his palm. He tugged at it, half curious, half afraid it might slip free as easily as it had gone on. But it did not move. It clung to him as though the damp earth had forged it to his bones. In the secret chamber, the hourglass waited, sands still whispering their steady fall. Alaric set his lantern on the table beside it, though the flame inside it was all but gone now, a last quivering star against the dark. He unwrapped the thin cloth he had used to hide the parchments before and spread them out once more. Beneath the flicker of light, he studied the lines that had haunted his dreams. To find the heart, find the well. To find the well, follow the breath of stone. The riddle that had brought him so deep and now led him back with iron at his wrist. He pressed his palm against the table, the ring's weight a circle of warmth where his skin met the cold wood. He felt different, anchored yet adrift at the same time. No crown of gold on his father's high seat could have made him feel this way. Not the mantle heavy with ermine, nor the sword they told him he would one day bear at his side. This was older than all of that. Older than Theobald's lineage, older perhaps than any parchment the scribes hoarded in the royal library. He thought of Master Edwin and his dry eyes blinking at him over ink-stained fingers. A crown must weigh upon the brow long before it ever rests there. Alaric smiled at the memory, tired, almost fond. This crown, he thought, did not rest on a brow at all. It bit into the flesh until it was part of him. A soft tap on the stone beyond the tapestry startled him from his drifting thoughts. He froze, ears straining. Another tap, so faint he wondered if the hush in the tunnels had simply followed him here, echoing in his mind. But then it came again, firmer this time, like the knock of knuckles on an old door. He rose, the hourglass whispering behind him, and slipped through the tapestry's frayed edge. On the other side, the corridor yawned empty, but at the far end, he saw a flicker of light, steady, warm, not the wavering flame of his guttering lantern, but the sure glow of a candle held in a practiced hand. There, half-shadowed by the arch of passage, stood old Swithin. The cook's broad shoulders hunched as ever, his face a map of creases and whiskers silvered with flour dust. In his free hand, he held a bundle wrapped in a cloth that looked suspiciously like it had come from the castle's buttery. "Well, there you are," Swithin grunted, as if they had only parted moments before. He lifted the candle higher, its flame catching the glint of the iron at Alaric's wrist. His eyes narrowed, not in surprise, but in some deep, quiet knowing that made the hush inside Alaric stir. "I wondered how far you'd follow the roots," Swithin said. He stepped closer, the candlelight brushing the stone walls, drawing shapes from shadows. "Didn't think you'd come back so soon, though. The old ones like to test the blood a bit longer." Alaric found his voice, though it rasped in his throat. "What is this?" He lifted his wrist, the ring dull in the candle's glow. "Why does it not come off?" Swithin gave a soft grunt that might have been a laugh. "Some crowns you can set aside when the feast ends, boy. Well, they mind you better than any steward. Better than your father's guards, I'd wager." He set the bundle on the floor between them, unwrapping it to reveal a loaf still warm, a small wedge of cheese, and a handful of dried plums. "You'll need strength," Swithin went on, his good eye gleaming in the candle's flicker. "The well's only the first breath. The roots go deeper yet." Alaric's mouth felt dry, though hunger bloomed in his belly at the smell of warm bread. He sank to his haunches, tore a piece free, and chewed in silence. Crumbs fell into the folds of his cloak, which smelled of stone dust and damp secrets now. "Why help me?" he asked at last, voice low. "Why not tell my father, or Edwin? They'd clap iron on my wrists for less." Swithin's mouth twisted into something not quite a smile. "And do what? Drag you up into the bright halls and tell all the world their prince's blood stirs the bones of the keep? Ha! They'd wall you up down there for fear you'd wake the rest of it." He tapped his temple with a floury finger. "Better a boy who listens to old stones than a king who fears his own foundations. Remember that." He nodded to the iron band. "When you wear that, the keep knows you. The roots know you. And they'll whisper back if you've the ears for it." Alaric's gaze drifted down to the hourglass chamber behind him, to the parchments, the circlet of silver beasts, the riddles that had carried him to the black pool. The bread sat heavy in his mouth, but he swallowed and asked, "What lies deeper?" Swithin's eyes, sharp beneath the cataract's cloud, flicked to the shadows. For a heartbeat, the hush that had followed Alaric from the pool seemed to breathe between them. "Not what, boy? Who?" The old cook leaned closer, his whisper soft as the roots above the pool. "There's more to the crown than iron and beast markings. It binds the blood, ties it back to what your father's father's fathers tried to bury in stone. They built over it to hold it quiet, but stone never forgets its own." He rose then, joints popping like old door hinges, and pressed the bundle's cloth into Alaric's hands. "Eat. Sleep when you can. Listen when the hush calls. When it does, come find me. I'll show you the next door." Before Alaric could shape another question, Swithin turned and vanished down the corridor, candle bobbing away until its glow was only another tremor of warmth swallowed by the dark. Alaric sat in the hush that returned to fill the corridor's empty ribs, the iron cool and sure on his wrist, the taste of bread and secrets warm on his tongue. Beneath him, the stone whispered, not in words, but in a pulse that matched his own, a crown above all crowns binding him to a history the bright halls had long forgotten how to fear. Alaric did not sleep that night, though he lay beneath the thick velvet canopy of his princely bed, the hush of the hidden passages still coiling in his ears. He let the warmth of Swithin's bread settle in his belly, and the iron band's weight at his wrist pressed into the pillow where he tucked it close to his chest, as if to remind himself that it was no dream conjured by shadows and stale candle smoke. Above his head, the embroidered curtains stirred gently with the draft that forever crept through the castle's ancient stones. He listened to it the way he might have once listened for his mother's lullabies when he was small, long before secrets and roots, before hourglasses and wells. But no lullaby came, only the soft sigh of stone remembering. When the dawn finally spilled through the narrow slit of his chamber's window, Alaric rose. He washed his hands and face in the cold basin, scrubbing at the smudges of earth beneath his nails until the skin reddened. He pulled on his richest tunic, lined with sable fur against the spring chill, and draped the iron-banded wrist in the long fall of his sleeve. When he stepped out into the waking keep, the hallways were already busy with servants lighting fires and nobles murmuring behind velvet drapes about trade and treaties and the Duke's planned visit. Master Edwin found him before the morning meal, as Alaric knew he would. The tutor's eyes narrowed when they caught the prince alone by the window that overlooked the misty courtyard. "Your Highness," Edwin murmured, voice as thin as the parchment he carried always at his hip. "You've slept poorly again." Alaric did not answer. He simply turned from the window and let Edwin fuss. Let him speak of lessons to come. Latin verses to be memorized. A scribe's account to be corrected, a bishop's visit that would demand the prince's polite nods and hollow answers. All the while, Alaric felt the iron band warm beneath his sleeve. A pulse steady and calm, more real than Edwin's droning voice, more alive than the painted saints that lined the chapel walls where he would soon be paraded. At the high table, King Theobald sat like a statue carved from old oak, broad shoulders draped in fur, his crown only a narrow band of gold that pressed his thinning hair flat against his brow. He regarded his son with eyes that saw a kingdom's heir and nothing else. Never the boy beneath the embroidered doublet, never the soil under his nails, or the hush of hidden tunnels clinging to his clothes. "Sit," the king said. "Eat. Listen." So Alaric did as commanded. He ate the soft bread and spiced pottage, though his tongue tasted only the memory of Swithin's rough loaf, still warm from the kitchen hearth. He listened as the king spoke of the duke's arrival, of tribute owed, of treaties that must be balanced like knives on a table. He nodded at the right moments, spoke when spoken to, a hollow vessel shaped by duty and expectation. When the meal ended and the nobles drifted away in clusters of velvet and whispered ambitions, Theobald caught his son's wrist, iron fingers on flesh, hard enough to bruise. For a heartbeat, Alaric feared the king would feel the ring beneath the sleeve, that he would sense the hush breathing against his skin. But Theobald only squeezed, eyes searching Alaric's face for something he would never name. "You dream too much," the king said, voice pitched for no ears but theirs. "Dreams unmake kings, boy. Remember that." Alaric did not answer. He only lowered his eyes, feeling the iron band warm under his father's grasp, like a pulse reminding him whose dreams these truly were. When at last Theobald released him, Alaric slipped away. He endured Edwin's lessons, his mind half there, half sinking down through flagstone and packed earth to the well, the copper crown, the black pool that still shimmered behind his eyes when he blinked too long. He wrote the Latin lines, his quill scratching through the silence, but beneath the droning syllables he mouthed the riddles instead. Beneath the crowned heart sleeps the door to the root. Wake it with the blood that binds. By dusk, the castle's corridors glowed with the soft gold of torches and rushlights. Alaric slipped through them like a ghost in silk, each footstep echoing down halls older than any living courtier could remember. He found his way back to the kitchens by instinct, drawn by the hush that pulsed inside him like a hidden drum. Swithin was waiting near the hearth, sleeves rolled, stirring a pot thick with barley and carrots for the servants' supper. When he saw Alaric, he jerked his chin toward the larder door. "Go on, then," he rasped, voice low enough to be lost in the crackle of the fire. "It's not my part to tell you more here. If you're ready, you'll find the next door waiting." Alaric stepped past him, the smell of smoke and onions clinging to his cloak. The larder door creaked on old hinges. Beyond it, sacks of flour and barrels of salted pork lined the walls, but Alaric ignored them. At the far end, behind a stack of firewood, a narrow panel of stone gaped slightly ajar. A breath of air colder than any cellar draft touched his cheek. He slipped inside. The panel clicked shut behind him with the softest whisper, as if the stone itself welcomed him back into its ribs. He lifted his hand to the iron band at his wrist, feeling its warmth steady him. Ahead, the passage sloped downward, deeper than he had ever gone beneath the keep's floors. No torch this time, only the hush and the faint pulse of his own heartbeat echoing back from walls that seemed closer than breath. As he stepped into that darkness, he did not feel like a prince who obeyed. He felt like something older, half remembered by the stones that watched him pass. And somewhere below, where the hush gathered in coiled roots and secret crowns, another door waited, ready to open at the blood's quiet knock. In the hush of dawn's tender hours, the castle of Wormwood lay shrouded in a silvery veil of drifting mist. The walls, cold with centuries of secrets, seemed to breathe as the world stirred awake beyond their ancient stones. Within the east wing of this fortress, young Prince Edwin sat at the edge of his canopied bed, the embroidered drapes drawn aside so the faint light could find him. He was no longer the boy who had once hidden beneath those velvet curtains, imagining dragons and valiant knights. He was a prince expected to rule. Yet in this fragile moment before the court's demands would come knocking, he allowed himself to linger in the realm of old stories. This morning brought no pageantry, no trumpets blare or chattering courtiers, only the gentle shuffle of Lady Eleanor, his governess since infancy, who moved about the chamber in silent ritual. She placed a bowl of warm rosewater at the washstand, her hands trembling slightly with age. Edwin rose and walked to her, the floor's chill seeping through his slippers, but he welcomed it. It reminded him that he was alive, still flesh and not just a gilded figure for the nobles to mold. "My lord," Lady Eleanor said softly, dipping a cloth into the scented water. She dabbed at his brow as if he were still that small boy. "You dreamed again?" Edwin gave a half smile. The dreams had grown stranger of late, visions of banquets where the guests spoke in riddles, of corridors that spiraled endlessly downward, of crowns that dripped with honey and ash. He did not speak of them. "Perhaps," he murmured instead, and took the cloth from her, finishing the ritual himself. This small rebellion made him feel more real. Below the window, the gardens of Wormwood lay in solemn rows of hedges and frost-laden fountains. Somewhere in that maze, the king, his father, would soon take his morning walk, flanked by 2 hawks perched on gloved fists, as though the birds alone might ward off the kingdom's decay. The court liked to whisper that King Aldrich found more loyalty in beasts than in his lords. Edwin wondered if that were true. He wondered, too, if he himself might become such a creature, untamed, aloof, yet tethered by iron and leather to the whims of a master. The day's first duty came on slippered feet. A summons arrived, carried not by a steward but by a child, a boy of no more than 7, dressed in the colors of House Veyron. He spoke not a word, only held out the scroll, eyes downcast. Edwin broke the seal, his heart tight in his chest as he read the florid hand of his father's scribe. "You will break fast with his majesty in the blue solar." It was not a request. It never was. Lady Eleanor sighed as he set the parchment aside. "You must wear the white doublet today, my prince, and the chain of the oak leaves." He nodded, though he disliked the chain. Heavy silver links engraved with tiny leaves, it had once belonged to his uncle, who had drowned in the river during a hunt gone wrong, or so the court said. Some said he had been pushed. Such was the way of royal life, to drape oneself in the heirlooms of the lost, to carry their weight and never ask too many questions. Soon, the blue solar greeted him with its vaulted ceiling painted to mimic the sky at dawn, sapphire and soft pearl streaked with gold leaf that gleamed in the candlelight. The king sat at a narrow table, alone but for a cluster of scrolls and wax-sealed letters. A single plate before him, cold venison, a heel of bread, and a goblet of dark wine. He looked up as Edwin entered, and for a moment, the boy glimpsed something like weariness in the king's pale eyes. "Come," Aldrich said. "Sit." Obediently, Edwin lowered himself to the chair opposite. The table was long enough for 10, yet only they occupied its cavernous silence. Servants drifted in and out like shadows, bringing fresh bread, honey, soft cheese. Edwin tried not to notice how his father ignored most of it, sipping instead at the wine as though it were the only balm for his thoughts. "Do you know why you are here?" the king asked at last, voice like a whetstone drawn along steel. Edwin hesitated. He knew better than to guess aloud. "To dine with you, father." Aldrich's lips twitched. Not quite a smile. "To listen, boy. To learn what is needed of you." He tapped one of the scrolls with a thick finger. "There is talk of an alliance with House Marrow. Their eldest daughter is of age. It would do you well to meet her before summer's end. A betrothal. Edwin's mouth went dry. He felt the walls of the solar pressing in, those painted skies mocking him with their promise of open air. He thought of the girl in question, Lady Ceres of Marrow, whom he had glimpsed once at a harvest feast. She had hair the color of a raven's wing, and eyes that never seemed to settle in one place for long, as though always searching for a door left ajar. "Yes, father," he said at last, because anything else would have been treason. "Good." The king leaned back, exhaling a faint hiss between his teeth. "We must keep the realm strong. Bloodlines must braid together like threads, or the whole cloth frays. You understand this?" Edwin nodded, though he wondered if his father truly believed in strength, or merely in survival. He pushed a piece of cheese across his plate, appetite gone. Somewhere in the courtyard beyond, he could hear the faint cry of a hawk, that sharp, wild note piercing the hush. "After the meal, you will ride with Sir Talon," Aldrich continued. "He will take you through the village. See it for yourself. These people who bow when you pass. They must be reminded that you are flesh and blood, not a ghost in a tower. And you, my son, must remember it too." "Yes, father." The king waved him away with a flick of his hand, already turning back to the letters piled high. Edwin stood, his legs stiff with the effort of standing so straight, so proper. He longed to run, not through the garden, but far beyond the walls, into the hush of the woods where no eyes could find him. But duty clung to him like the oak leaf chain at his throat, cold and unyielding. Outside the solar, Sir Talon waited in the shadow of a carved archway. His armor gleamed despite the early hour, and his eyes, pale as storm-washed stone, met Edwin's with a flicker of something almost like pity. "Ready, my prince?" he asked. Edwin nodded. The corridors of Wormwood unspooled before them, echoing with their footfalls. Somewhere deep inside, the young prince wondered if he would find something in the village that would tether him to this life he had not chosen, or if the village, like the court, would only remind him how very far he still was from freedom. Together, they stepped into the waiting dawn. The road that wound from the iron gates of Wormwood into the village beyond was flanked by ancient elms, their branches bending low, as if to whisper secrets to any rider bold enough to pass beneath their shade. Prince Edwin rode alongside Sir Talon, the seasoned night stallion, a full head taller than Edwin's bay mare. The hooves struck the earth in a slow, deliberate rhythm, each step a soft drumbeat, marking the prince's uneasy passage from the safety of stone walls to the restless hum of common life. The village lay still waking when they arrived. Wisps of chimney smoke rose to meet the morning breeze, curling above thatched roofs patched with lichen and moss. Hens clucked softly in small yards enclosed by crooked fences. Here and there, villagers paused at the sight of the royal pair, kneeling slightly, heads lowered, yet their eyes darted back up as soon as they dared, hungry for a glimpse of the boy who might one day wear the crown. Edwin felt their stares pressing against his skin like nettles. He wanted to smile, to wave perhaps, but Sir Talon's voice murmured at his side, "Hold your chin high, my prince. Let them see the oak leaves." So he did. The chain lay heavy against his chest, a cold reminder of all he must pretend to be. He rode past a blacksmith's forge where the hammer's ring fell silent at his approach, past a baker's stall where warm loaves waited to be bartered for coppers. A girl of no more than 9 stood behind the bread, flour dusting her hair like frost. When Edwin's eyes met hers, she did not look away. Instead, she offered the smallest, bravest smile. He wished he could have returned it fully, but Sir Talon pressed on, leading them deeper into the tangle of narrow lanes. "Do you see them, my prince?" the knight asked, not unkindly. "They would follow you into flame if asked, but they must believe you are more than just a boy in fine cloth." Edwin said nothing. He only listened to the creak of leather bridles, the distant bark of a dog, the low murmur of voices slipping through doorways and windows. To rule was to be watched, to be weighed in silence by those who would never speak their judgments aloud. He wondered how many of these villagers dreamed of being him, never knowing that he dreamed instead of being one of them, nameless, free to vanish into the woods and not return until he chose. They came to the market square at last, where a single gnarled tree rose from a circle of uneven stones. Its roots cracked the earth beneath, and children often tied ribbons to its lowest branches for luck. Today, a cluster of folk gathered round a man with a lute, his cracked voice telling some half-remembered ballad of a hero who had slain a serpent beneath a blood-red moon. The tale drifted on the wind, words snatched away before Edwin could catch them all. Sir Talon dismounted first, handing his reins to a stable boy who appeared from nowhere, barefoot and bright-eyed. Edwin followed, his boots touching the worn stones of the square with a faint scrape that drew every gaze his way. He felt suddenly smaller without the mare beneath him. Here, among the folk whose hands were rough with toil, he was not so much a prince as a promise, a fragile hope that things might change or stay the same, depending on whom you asked. They moved through the stalls slowly. Sir Talon spoke with the cloth merchant, asked after the weaver's sick child, offered a word to the potter about taxes soon to be eased. Edwin listened, nodding where he ought, repeating the careful phrases he had been taught. Your work does us honor, and may your hearth stay warm through winter's chill. Each word felt like a coin pressed into a waiting palm, necessary, weighty, yet never quite enough to buy real closeness. When they reached the far side of the square, Sir Talon gestured for Edwin to pause. Before them, on a rough blanket laid over the cold ground, an old woman knelt beside baskets of wild herbs and bundles of lavender. Her hair was silver, plaited down her back, and her hands moved deftly as she tied stems together with bits of twine. When she looked up, Edwin saw eyes like clouded glass, sightless yet searching. "Good wife Thera," Sir Talon said, inclining his head with genuine respect. "This is Prince Edwin, son of Aldrich, king of Wormwood." The woman's mouth curved in a shape halfway between a grin and a grimace. "A king's son? Come to my blanket? Has the castle run out of lavender then?" Her voice rasped like parchment. The folk nearby laughed softly, but with fondness, not malice. Edwin knelt, ignoring the tug of his doublet. He could smell the herbs, sharp rosemary, sweet chamomile, the earthy musk of sage. "What do you sell, good wife?" "Bits of this and that for those who ache," Thera said. She reached forward, and astonishingly, her fingertips found his wrist, papery and warm. "And what of you, young lord? Do you ache too?" He almost pulled back, but her touch was gentle, unthreatening. He thought of his dreams, of corridors spiraling forever downward, of the crown dripping honey and ash. "Perhaps," he whispered, so low that only she could hear. She tilted her head as if to better hear the truth that words would not say. Then she pressed a small bundle into his palm, sprigs of lavender tied with a red thread. "Keep it under your pillow, prince who aches," she murmured. "It may not banish the dreams, but it will remind you the dawn always comes." Sir Talon cleared his throat, gently drawing Edwin back to his feet. A nod of thanks, a coin placed in the woman's bowl, a final glance at the herbs. Then they moved on, but Edwin held the lavender tight in his fist, the scent rising to meet him like a secret promise. When they returned to their horses, the village square behind them, Edwin turned once more to look at the folk of Wormwood. They were still watching him, some with hope, some with hunger, some with weary indifference. He wondered which gaze would be his undoing in the end. Beside him, Sir Talon spoke low. "Remember what you saw today, my prince. These people will one day be yours to protect, or to fail." Edwin nodded. He slipped the lavender into his breast pocket, close to his heart. For now, it was all the armor he could bear. When they returned to the castle gates, the sun had climbed higher, shedding its gentle morning hush for the sharper gleam of approaching noon. The guards saluted, halberds striking stone in perfect unison as the heavy portcullis creaked upward. Prince Edwin felt the shift at once, how the air within the walls pressed closer, thick with the hush of secrets, the murmur of servants, the steady heartbeat of life lived under watchful eyes. Sir Talon left him at the stables with a nod and a few murmured words about duty, about remembering the faces of the villagers whose bread and salt filled the royal tables. Edwin thanked him, though the words tasted stale on his tongue. He dismounted slowly, his legs stiff, the chain of oak leaves heavier than ever around his neck. A stable hand, freckles scattered across his nose like a constellation, took the reins of the mare with wide, awed eyes. "Did you ride far, my prince?" the boy asked, barely above a whisper. "Far enough," Edwin replied, and the boy grinned, showing a gap where 2 teeth were missing. For a heartbeat, Edwin envied him that easy smile, unburdened by the weight of crowns and alliances, free of the dreams that left one waking with sweat at the nape of the neck. Inside the keep, shadows gathered in the corridors, despite the warmth of day. Tapestries fluttered faintly in the drafts that snaked through arrow slits and cracks in the ancient mortar. Edwin passed them without really seeing the hunts and battles woven in gold and crimson thread. Instead, his thoughts lingered on Goodwife Thera's lavender, tucked safe within his pocket, its scent seeping through the embroidered linen of his doublet, a whisper of fields and freedom. He made his way to the library, where the hush was deeper still. Here, the air tasted of dust and old vellum, beeswax candles burning low along rows of shelves that rose toward vaulted ceilings. A single tall window spilled pale light across a long oaken table littered with scrolls and heavy tomes. At its far end sat Lady Eleanor, spectacles perched upon the tip of her nose as she deciphered the looping Latin of an illuminated manuscript. "My prince," she murmured without looking up, voice soft as a lullaby. "Come sit. There are lessons yet to tend." Edwin sank into the chair opposite, feeling the ache of his ride settle into his bones. He watched Lady Eleanor's fingers, thin and precise, as they traced a passage that told of treaties signed in candlelit chambers, of lands won not by the sword but by the inked stroke of a quill. He wondered how many kingdoms had been lost by the same. "Do you recall the Edict of Hymir?" she asked, lifting her gaze to peer at him over the rims of her spectacles. "Yes, lady," Edwin answered, though the truth was softer than the lie. He remembered fragments, a marriage pact sealed with the promise of a winter's harvest, a rebellion snuffed out in blood and silence. She nodded, seemingly satisfied. "Power rarely shouts, my dear. It whispers, it murmurs, it waits for fools to shout themselves hoarse, and when the noise is gone, it remains." He thought of his father's hawks, the way they perched so still upon the king's gauntlet, silent until the signal came to strike. He wondered if he, too, was being trained to strike in silence. Lady Eleanor set aside the manuscript, folding her hands atop it. Her eyes, gray as river stones, searched his face. "You are restless, Edwin." The sound of his name, unadorned by title, pulled something loose inside him. "I saw the village today, the people. They look at me as if I am some charm or curse. I do not know which." She smiled faintly, lines deepening around her mouth. "Both, perhaps. Such is royalty. You are the promise of what might be and the reminder of what cannot be changed." Outside the window, he could hear the courtyard stir, footfalls on flagstones, the faint ring of a blacksmith's hammer from the lower bailey. Life pulsed just beyond the hush of this sanctuary, loud and real in ways the pages of treaties could never quite capture. "Tell me, lady," he asked, leaning forward so that his voice would not carry beyond them. "When you were young, did you ever wish to be free of these walls?" She tilted her head, considering. "Freedom is a strange thing, my prince. Those who have it dream of duty. Those with duty dream of freedom, and so the wheel turns." He let her words settle between them like drifting ash. Then, from his pocket, he drew out the bundle of lavender Thera had pressed into his palm. He placed it on the table, watching the pale purple buds tremble in the shaft of light. Lady Eleanor's gaze softened. "Ah, Goodwife Thera still gives her blessings, then? She said it would remind me that dawn always comes." Eleanor touched the lavender with a fingertip. "It does, but we must live through the night to see it. Do not fear your dreams, Edwin. Fear the day you stop having them." He wanted to ask her what she dreamed of, but the question caught in his throat. Instead, he let her guide him back to his studies. Lines of old laws, the naming of distant baronies, the marriages that had stitched kingdoms together like patchwork quilts. He listened, repeated the names, but all the while the lavender's quiet scent lingered, pulling him back to the village square, to the child's gap-toothed grin, to the warmth of earth beneath his boots. Hours passed, candles burned low. When at last Lady Eleanor declared the day's lessons done, Edwin rose, his mind heavy with dates and titles, yet lighter somehow for the single truth the lavender offered, that even within these stone walls there might yet be a place for small, stubborn dreams to grow. He stepped from the library into the deepening dusk. Shadows stretched long across the courtyard, braziers flickering to life one by one. Somewhere above, the first evening star blinked awake, bright and alone. Edwin touched the lavender in his pocket once more and made a silent promise to himself that when the crown came, as it surely would, He would not let it crush whatever tender things still beat inside him. And for tonight, that promise was enough. Night settled over Wormwood with a hush so deep it seemed to soften even the chill stone beneath its touch. Torches sputtered in iron sconces along the corridors, casting flickering pools of light that danced upon the ancient tapestries. Edwin moved through these passageways alone now, his footsteps muffled by the thick rugs that lined the floors of the royal wing. Behind him, the library door stood closed, the scent of old parchment and lavender lingering on his sleeves like a memory. He did not return to his chamber at once. Instead, some quiet urging within him turned his steps toward the western tower, a place he had not visited in many months. The guards at the stair bowed their heads but did not question him. Who would question a prince on his own restless wanderings, especially one whose footsteps were softer than secrets? The climb was long, the stone steps worn concave by generations of feet that had carried burdens heavier than crowns. At the top, an iron-banded door waited, its hinges creaking a soft complaint when Edwin pressed it open. Beyond lay the old observatory, a room forgotten by all but a handful of servants, tasked with dusting its corners and keeping the glass of its great dome free of grime. Inside, the ceiling soared away into darkness, broken only by the ancient brass and glass contraption that turned slowly on its pivot, an armillary sphere that caught the moonlight and fractured it into trembling shards across the walls. Shelves lined with scrolls and star charts ringed the room, but Edwin's eyes went instead to the far alcove, where a narrow window opened out onto the night. He crossed to it, pressing his palms to the cold stone sill. Far below, the castle grounds stretched like a patchwork of darkness and pale torch glow. The gardens, the courtyard, the stables where his mare likely dozed in a stall still warm from her return. Beyond the walls, the village lay nestled in the valley's cradle, its thatched roofs bathed in moonlight that turned frost to silver. He wondered if the little girl at the bread stall slept now with her mother's stories in her ears. If Goodwife Thera dreamed dreams untroubled by blind eyes. If somewhere in the village square the lute player still strummed soft chords to the night, his song drifting up toward these cold towers like a prayer. A soft rustle broke his thoughts. He turned to find himself not alone. Near the base of the armillary stood a figure half-shadowed. Sir Talon, though now the knight wore neither armor nor surcoat but simple dark wool, the sword at his hip the only reminder of his office. "You favor this place," Talon said, voice low enough to not startle the hush away. Edwin managed a tired smile. "Did you follow me?" "I watch you, my prince. That is my charge." Edwin did not bristle at the words. He only returned his gaze to the window, feeling the knight's presence settle beside him like a silent hound at the heel. "I don't come here often," Edwin said after a time. "But when I do, I remember. When I was small, my mother would bring me here. She said the stars would listen if I spoke gently enough." He did not say her name. None did. Not now. Queen Elaine had been gone near 10 winters, carried off by a fever that no physician's poultice or whispered prayer could soften. Yet here, in this forgotten room of turning brass and starlight, she felt closer than anywhere else within the castle's unyielding walls. "Did you speak to them tonight?" Talon asked. "Not yet." Edwin's breath misted the chill air. "Do you think they hear us, Sir Talon? The dead?" Talon was quiet so long that Edwin wondered if he would answer at all. Then, softly, "I think they do, if we have the courage to listen back." It was not the answer of a knight, but of a man, and Edwin found he was grateful for it. He leaned forward against the sill, the lavender bundle still tucked in his pocket, a small pulse of warmth against the chill. "Why do you stay, Talon?" he asked suddenly. "You could ride away, find some quiet place. A farm. A family." Talon's laugh was softer than a sigh. A knight's oaths are not so easily left in the dust behind him. Besides, where would I go that my shadow would not follow? Better to stand watch here, where I might do some good. Edwin turned to him then, studying the knight's face in the moonlight. It was lined in places where old scars had faded to pale ridges, but the eyes were kind, clear as river ice. "Will you always watch me?" Edwin asked, not as a prince, but as the boy he still was beneath all the silks and chains. "If you will have it so," Talon said. Silence settled between them again, but it was companionable, gentle, From the window, Edwin lifted his gaze to the sky, where a spill of stars lay scattered across the black, a river of fire frozen mid-flow. He thought of Lady Eleanor's words, "Fear the day you stop dreaming." He thought of Thera's lavender, a promise of dawn, and of this moment, high above the sleeping world, where he could speak truths too fragile for daylight. "Then watch me now, Sir Talon," he whispered, "and remember that I am not yet a crown. Not yet." The knight did not answer with words. He only stood beside him as the armillary sphere turned, brass rings tracing slow orbits through the hush. Together, they watched the stars listen back. And for a little while longer, the boy who would be king remained only a boy, silent, starlit, and unbound. When Edwin left the old observatory at last, the night had grown deeper still, and the castle's passageways lay hushed as a monastery in winter. His boots tapped softly on flagstones slick with cold drafts that slipped beneath ancient doors. He passed under vaulted arches, through shadowed galleries where portraits of kings long dead watched him with eyes painted to mimic life, but never quite succeeding. He paused once before one such portrait, a tall man in a dark cloak, a crown resting crooked upon his brow. The plaque beneath named him King Roderick the Warden, a ruler whose reign had ended in whispers and locked doors. Edwin stared into that painted face, wondering if any scrap of the man still lingered, sealed within these walls like breath caught in stone. Will they paint me too one day? He wondered. Will they hang me here? A face behind glass eyes? Another story the children pass without listening? The thought made his chest tighten, so he turned away, moving onward to where the shadows thickened near the western wing. Here the stonework changed, older, rougher, patched in places where time's patient teeth had gnawed too deeply. Few courtiers lingered here after dusk. They claimed drafts rattled the doors, that strange sounds rose through the floorboards at night, the ghosts of half-forgotten ancestors whispering through the mortar. Edwin did not fear them. If there were ghosts, he thought, perhaps they were lonely for company just as he was. At the end of a corridor, half hidden behind a faded tapestry, he reached the door he sought, a simple oak plank reinforced with iron bands, unadorned but for a small iron latch polished smooth by countless hands. He lifted it carefully and stepped inside. The chamber beyond was modest for a prince. A small hearth, the embers banked low, a plain writing desk, a narrow bed draped in woolen blankets rather than velvet. Here was the place he claimed for himself when courtly duties choked the breath from his chest. Only Lady Eleanor and Sir Talon knew of it. Here, no guards waited at the threshold, no servants crept about to tend to unseen comforts. Here, Edwin was simply Edwin. He shrugged off the heavy doublet, the oak leaf chain clinking as he laid it atop the desk. In the hearth's dim glow, he saw the bundle of parchment he had left days ago, scraps of writing, lines of half-finished thoughts scrawled in ink that sometimes ran where candle wax had dripped. He gathered them up, settling onto the chair, letting the hush cradle him like a blanket. One scrap read, "A crown is heavier than any blade." Another, "What good is rule if the ruler's heart is chained?" And another, softer still, "I dreamed of a door that led to the river, and the river led me home." He did not know if he would ever show these words to anyone. They were small freedoms, born in quiet moments between lessons and obligations. They asked nothing of him except honesty, and perhaps that was why he treasured them more than any jewel in his father's vault. Outside, a wind rose, rattling the shutters with a hollow moan. Edwin rose to wedge them tighter, then paused as he caught sight of the world below. The castle courtyard lay silvered under the waxing moon, its stones veined with frost. Far beyond, the woods sprawled like a dark ocean at the edge of the world. Somewhere in that vastness, he knew, wolves roamed, their howls echoing down the hills. As a boy, he had feared those howls. Now he found them oddly comforting, a reminder that wildness still lived just beyond the walls, untamed, unconquered. He lit a single candle on the desk and returned to his papers. Dipping his quill into the inkwell, he began to write again. Not decrees, not treaties, but the sort of words that might never matter to a court, yet mattered greatly to him. Words of rivers and open doors, of hawks uncaged, of stars that did not answer to crowns. Sometimes he paused to listen, half expecting to hear his mother's voice woven through the crackle of the hearth. He imagined her hand resting lightly upon his shoulder, the warmth of her presence stronger than any cloak the kingdom might drape upon him. When his eyes grew heavy, he gathered the scraps and tucked them carefully beneath the blanket on his narrow bed. He placed Goodwife Thera's lavender beside his pillow, breathing in its soft, clean promise that dreams, however strange, were not the enemy, but the lanterns one carried through the long corridors of night. He lay down, the fire's glow dancing across the beams above. His mind drifted to the village children, to Lady Ceres of Marrow, raven-haired, restless-eyed, waiting in some distant chamber of fate. He wondered if she dreamed of doors too. Outside, the wolves sang again, their voices a chorus to the hush that pressed gently against the walls. And within that hush, Edwin closed his eyes, the prince drifting into sleep not as a future king, but as a boy who still dared to dream of rivers, wild woods, and the quiet freedom that might yet lie beyond the crown's heavy reach. Morning returned as it always did, soft at first, like a hand brushing sleep from tired eyes, then bolder as the sun's pale rays slipped through the narrow window above Edwin's small bed. The lavender still lay where he had placed it beside his pillow, its scent faint but stubborn, mingling now with the cool breath of dawn that drifted in through a cracked shutter. Edwin stirred slowly, reluctant to rise too quickly and let the quiet break. He lay listening to the sounds that seep through stone, the distant clang of the blacksmith's hammer in the lower yard, the faint clatter of kitchen servants rousing the day's first embers, the creak of cartwheels in the courtyard below as deliveries arrived from the village. Flour, apples, salted meat. Life, steady as the beating of his own heart. He sat up, pushing aside the rough blanket, his feet touching the cold floor with a soft hiss of surprise. It grounded him, this small discomfort, this reminder that even within walls lined with silk and gold thread, the world beyond still had teeth and chill edges. Today, the chain of oak leaves would wait. In this hidden chamber, no one would demand he wear it. For a while, he dressed himself in a plain tunic and trousers, garments so simple they might have belonged to any stable lad. At the mirror, small, its silvering tarnished, he studied his reflection. No crown there. No sign of power, but for the flicker of thought behind tired eyes. A soft knock came at the door. 2 taps, then a pause, then one more. Lady Eleanor's signal. Edwin crossed the small room and drew back the latch. She slipped inside, like a wraith of warm shawls and gentle scolding, her arms burdened with a bundle of fresh linens and a small covered dish. "Your Highness," she chided, but her tone was fond. "Do you mean to waste away in this little cell of yours? The court would believe I starve you if they saw how thin you grow here." Edwin gave her a weary smile. "Then we shall let them believe it. Perhaps they will pity me." She clucked her tongue and set the dish on the desk, lifting its lid to reveal soft cheese, dark bread still warm from the ovens, and a single boiled egg. He sat gratefully and tore the bread apart with his hands, the steam curling into the chill air like a promise of comfort. Lady Eleanor busied herself tidying what little there was to straighten, folding the blanket, plumping the pillow, retrieving yesterday's scattered scraps of parchment and stacking them in neat order. She paused over one scrap that had fallen to the floor, squinting at the inked lines. "A river leads me home," she read softly. She did not mock the words, nor ask why a prince would write such things. Instead, she placed it gently atop the pile, as if it were worth more than any decree stamped with the king's seal. When Edwin had eaten his fill, she poured a small cup of spiced wine from a flask she had hidden in her shawl. He accepted it gratefully, savoring the warmth that spread through him with each sip. Eleanor sat across from him on the low stool, her eyes catching the dawn's weak glow filtering through the window. "Today you must return to your father's hall," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "There are matters he wishes you to witness. Petitions, disputes, the settling of village quarrels." Edwin sighed, letting the cup rest between his palms. A day of listening to men squabble over fences and hens. And yet, she reminded him, it is from such squabbles that kingdoms are born, and sometimes broken. The people must see you beside the king. They must believe your ear is their own. He did not argue, though his shoulders slumped under an invisible weight. He looked down at his simple tunic, the softness of his hidden room already slipping from his grasp like sand through fingers. Lady Eleanor rose and crossed to him, laying her thin hand atop his head as she had when he was small. "You are more than the chain, Edwin. Remember that." When she was gone, he lingered a moment longer. He gathered his pages, folding them carefully into a leather folio, then tucked it into a hidden space within the writing desk, safe for another night when words might spill from him like water seeking cracks in stone. At last, he donned the clothes befitting a prince, the white doublet stitched with threads of gold, the dark breeches, the high boots polished to a dull gleam. The oak leaf chain rested in its coffer, gleaming cold and weighty. He lifted it, feeling its chill bite against his skin as he draped it across his shoulders. When he stepped from the hidden chamber back into the waking castle, the hush closed behind him like a sigh. A steward waited, bowing low, his eyes flicking to the chain at Edwin's throat. A silent measure taken, a box ticked, a duty fulfilled. The walk to the king's hall was slow and ceremonial. He passed through corridors that grew wider with each turn, the hush giving way to the faint stir of courtiers gathering like birds in the branches of power. Noblemen in long cloaks, ladies in trailing silks, pages carrying baskets of scrolls. They bowed as he passed, heads dipping like reeds in wind, but their eyes always flicked upward, quick as foxes, to mark his face, his manner, his quiet steps. At the threshold of the hall he paused. Beyond lay the murmur of voices, the smell of burning pitch in the braziers, the weight of centuries pressing down from rafters carved with the sigils of his line. He drew a breath, steadying the soft echo of rivers and stars that still lingered at the edge of his mind. Then Prince Edwin stepped forward, the hush falling away behind him as he crossed into the realm of oak and iron and whispered oaths. A prince once more, but not yet a king, and not yet lost. The hall of wormwood, vast and echoing, held within its stone ribs the voices of men who believed themselves masters of a realm they would never fully tame. As Edwin stepped inside, the murmur of lords and stewards dulled, softening to a hush that trailed behind him like a cloak. High above, the banners of his house hung motionless, heavy with the dust of countless winters, deep blue stitched with the sigil of the oak crowned by a single star. At the far end of the hall, upon the dais, his father sat enthroned in a carved seat of blackened oak, its armrests shaped like the wings of stoic hawks. King Aldrich, robed in deep fur and leather, leaned forward as a gray-bearded steward recited names from a scroll that never seemed to end. Between each name, a supplicant stepped forth, kneeling, bowing, pleading, then withdrew with a new burden or a small mercy pressed into their hands. Edwin crossed the hall with measured steps. The courtiers watched him pass, their hushed words stitched together in a tapestry of rumor. He could feel it, how they weighed him with their glances, searching for cracks in the prince's polished mask. He wondered if they would see the lavender tucked into the lining of his sleeve, the hidden defiance in that simple sprig of dry purple bloom. Aldrich's eyes found him before he reached the dais. There was no smile in them, only the cold clarity of a falcon's regard. The king did not gesture, but Edwin knew to stand just behind and to the right, close enough to be seen, far enough to be silent. It was a place of display, nothing more, yet in the ritual of it, there was power. "See," the lords would murmur, "the line holds. The boy stands ready. The blood endures." Hours passed as the hall breathed and murmured around him. A tanner knelt to beg forgiveness for hides gone missing, stolen, he claimed, by highwaymen on the North Road. A pair of farmers argued bitterly over a strip of land where the old boundary stones had sunk into the thawing earth. Their quarrel twisted into talk of bramble hedges, of lambs found on the wrong side of a ditch, of insults flung at dusk when tempers ran hotter than sense. The king listened, patient but distant, his voice calm as he issued fines, pardons, commands. Beside him, Edwin stood still as carved wood, yet inside his mind drifted elsewhere. He wondered if the river beyond the village still ran fast and cold beneath its thin skin of spring ice. If Goodwife Thera sat by her hearth now, her blind eyes turned inward as she tasted some dream of a summer not yet born. He thought of Sir Talon's quiet loyalty, of Lady Eleanor's gentle scolding, of the pages hidden beneath his pillow, scraps of himself the court would never know. A stir broke his drifting thoughts. A name spoken, one he recognized but did not expect. House Marrow. The steward's voice rang clear, cutting through the torpor of the hall like a cold blade. A girl stepped forward from the line of petitioners. She was taller than he remembered, wrapped in a mantle of deep green lined with fur. Raven dark hair spilled in waves from beneath her hood, and when she lowered it, the hall seemed to lean forward to catch the flicker of her eyes, dark, restless, glinting with something unspoken. Lady Saris of Marrow. She did not kneel immediately. Instead, she met the king's stare with a tilt of her chin that spoke of a will iron strong beneath all the silks. Then, slowly, she lowered herself to one knee, her cloak pooling around her like a forest at dusk. "Your Majesty," she said, her voice clear enough that even the lords in the far shadows caught its steel edge. "I come on behalf of my father, Lord Marrow, who is hindered by illness and sends his dutiful daughter in his stead." Aldrich studied her, fingers drumming the armrest. "And what petition does House Marrow bring before its king?" She lifted her gaze, first to Aldrich, then, deliberately, to Edwin, standing silent at the king's shoulder. In that fleeting glance, Edwin felt as if she could see through the chain at his throat, through the doublet's stiff brocade, down to the hidden scraps of dreams he thought safe in darkness. "My father wishes to renew his vow of fealty," she said, "and to remind His Majesty that Marrow's harvests will stand loyal as ever. And—" Here she paused, so faintly that only Edwin caught the slight hitch of her breath. "And that his daughter remains at the king's disposal should a union strengthen the realm." A hush followed. It rolled down the length of the hall, through the ranks of nobles who now studied Edwin as if he were no longer a statue of oak and silk, but a figure of flesh that might be bartered, wedded, bound. Aldrich's mouth curved, though whether in approval or amusement, no one could say. "You speak well for one so young," he said. "Stand, Lady Saris. Let us look upon Marrow's promise." She rose fluidly, her eyes never flinching from the king's. Edwin felt his own breath snag in his throat when her gaze flicked back to him just for an instant, as if she were taking his measure, not as a prince, but as a boy forced into the mold of a crown. "I would have you remain at Wormwood for a time," Aldrich said. "Acquaint yourself with these halls, this court you may yet call home. Will you do this?" Her smile was small, a flicker like moonlight on a blade's edge. "If it pleases His Majesty," a gesture from the steward, a flurry of courtiers bowing her aside. She stepped back, her cloak brushing Edwin's boots as she passed. For one heartbeat, he caught the faintest trace of her scent, pine needles and the sea wind, wild and sharp, utterly unlike the stale sweetness of Wormwood's perfumed halls. She did not look back as she was led away, yet Edwin felt the air she left behind, crackling with questions no decree could smother. The hall's drone resumed, more petitions, more quarrels, more nods and fines and promises. But to Edwin, the hush behind the noise had changed. It whispered not only of crowns and oaths, but of something fragile and dangerous, something that smelled of forests and salt air and freedom, should he dare to reach for it. And deep within him, beneath the chain of oak leaves and all its centuries of duty, a quiet voice whispered back, "Not yet, but soon." The hall gradually emptied as the sun crept toward its zenith, spilling weak gold through the high, narrow windows. The petitions slowed, each new one met with the same cool nod or dismissive flick of King Aldrich's hand. When at last the steward rolled up his scroll and bowed low, the hush that followed felt almost like a held breath, an invisible exhale waiting for the next weight to fall. Edwin remained at his father's side, hands clasped behind his back, the chain of oak leaves a cold promise pressed against his collarbones. He could feel the sweat gathering beneath the links, but he did not lift a hand to wipe it away. A prince did not fidget. A prince did not reveal the burden of the crown before he wore it. At length, Aldrich rose. The rustle of his heavy fur-lined cloak filled the silence like the sound of crows lifting from a field. Without looking at his son, the king spoke low enough for only Edwin to hear. "Walk with me." They left the dais together, crossing the hall under the watchful gaze of courtiers who bowed in practiced waves. The great doors parted at a wordless signal, and father and son stepped into a corridor lined with cold banners and colder statues. Heroes of Wormwood's bloodline, each carved with the same unyielding jaw, the same hollow eyes that seemed to follow Edwin's every step. They did not speak until they reached the far cloister, where arched windows framed the courtyard gardens below. Spring's slow breath had begun to stir the hedgerows awake. Patches of snow lingered in the shaded corners, shrinking day by day beneath the pale sun. Here the king paused, gloved hands clasped behind his back as he stared down at the fountains and gravel paths. "You saw her," Aldrich said at last, voice flat as a drawn blade. He did not name Lady Ceres, yet the silence made the name echo all the louder between them. "Yes, father," Edwin answered. He kept his own hands still, though they itched to touch the lavender hidden in his sleeve. His small defiance, now more precious than ever. Aldrich's eyes, pale as frost, slid sideways to measure him. "She will stay. You will speak with her. You will learn if her father's promise holds true through her. The Marrows have lands we need, grain and salt, and a coastline our enemies would barter dearly for." Edwin's throat felt dry. "And if she does not wish it?" Aldrich's brow twitched, a ghost of a frown. "Do you?" A heartbeat passed between them, father and son, ruler and pawn. Edwin's voice was soft but steady. "I wish only for what serves the realm." The king's mouth curved at that, a smile that never touched his eyes. "Well spoken. Remember, boy, kings do not marry for themselves. They marry for the soil beneath their boots, for the fields and rivers their children's children will one day claim." Edwin turned his gaze to the gardens, where a pair of kitchen maids crossed the courtyard with baskets of linens balanced on their hips. They laughed as they walked, free in a way that caught at something raw in his chest. "And if the soil turns to ash?" Edwin asked, not daring to look back at the king. Aldrich's voice was a quiet hiss. "Then we build it anew. That is the shape of rule. We do not inherit peace, we craft it. Stone by stone, oath by oath, sacrifice by sacrifice." He did not say whose sacrifice, but he did not need to. The weight of the oak leaves at Edwin's throat spoke well enough. They stood in silence a while longer. Beneath them, the courtyard echoed with life, voices, laughter, the creak of a gardener's cart rolling over gravel. Above, a pale falcon wheeled in the sky, feathers catching the sun before it vanished behind a drifting cloud. At last, Aldrich turned away. "She will dine with us tonight," he said. "See her well. She is clever, that one. Too clever, perhaps. Be careful what you show her." He strode off without waiting for a reply, boots striking the stone with a rhythm as unwavering as a drumbeat of war. Left alone, Edwin leaned one palm against the cold sill of the arched window. His breath fogged the glass, a fleeting ghost that vanished as quickly as it came. He thought of Lady Ceres's eyes, sharp, watchful, alive with questions the court would never ask aloud. He wondered if she, too, wore chains hidden beneath silks, if she carried a sprig of something wild tucked close to her heart. When the bells called for the noon meal, he did not go at once. Instead, he lingered by the window until the sun broke free of its cloud and poured down upon the gardens below. He watched the maids vanish through a side door, laughter trailing behind them like ribbons on the wind. A king does not marry for himself, his father had said. Edwin turned the words over like a stone in his hand, feeling their cold shape press into his palm. But somewhere beneath that stone, a seed waited, quiet, stubborn, alive. He touched the lavender at his sleeve and let the warmth of its small, fragile promise hold him steady against the hush that pressed all around. The hour of the evening meal came draped in the hush of candlelight and soft murmurs that drifted through the great hall like smoke from a hearth. Long tables were set beneath the watchful gaze of ancestral banners, silver and pewter gleaming beside trenchers of roast fowl and root vegetables. Servants glided between the seated nobles like shadows in linen and wool, refilling goblets with spiced wine, tending the fires that guttered and flared along the walls. Prince Edwin sat at the king's right hand, his chain of oak leaves cool against his throat, though the hall was warm with the press of bodies and the slow hum of gossip. On the king's left, Lady Ceres of Marrow had taken her place, a place earned not by invitation alone, but by the heavy promise that rode her name. She wore no crown, yet her presence drew every glance. Her gown was the deep green of a forest at dusk, sleeves trailing like the shadows of branches, silver pins catching the torchlight where they clasped her dark hair away from her face. She held her goblet lightly, as if it were a prop in a quiet play, and her eyes, sharp as a hawk's, rarely rested on her plate. Instead, they drifted, unhurried from face to face, reading the small betrayals that passed across lips and narrowed eyes when nobles thought no one was watching. Once or twice those eyes found Edwin's, and each time he felt an odd prickling along his ribs, like frost creeping over a window pane, beautiful and cold, yet alive with the hint of thaw. The king spoke little as the meal stretched on, preferring instead to let the gathered lords and ladies fill the silence with tales of livestock born early or taxes overdue, of border disputes smoothed over by coin or threats. Edwin heard the words but did not hold them. His mind drifted, snagged on the curve of Ceres's hand as it traced the rim of her goblet, on the tilt of her head when she listened without truly listening. At length, when the last course, an apple tart glazed with honey, was cleared away, Aldrich turned to Lady Ceres and said, in that voice that made even the oldest lord lean forward to catch every word, "You have found wormwood to your liking, I trust." Ceres's answering smile was small, yet it carried a flicker of something sharp beneath its grace. "It is as I remember it, your majesty, cold stones and warm gossip." A ripple of muted laughter rose and faded among the nearest courtiers. The king's mouth curved, though his eyes stayed flat and pale. "May it prove warmer still in time. You and my son will find much to speak of, I think." He did not glance at Edwin, but the weight of expectation hung in the air like a drawn blade. Before Edwin could form some careful princely reply, Ceres spoke first. "If His Highness would walk with me," she said, voice pitched so gently that only those nearest could hear, "I should like to see how the gardens sleep beneath this late spring frost." The king gave a single nod, permission and command in one. Edwin rose, the chain at his throat shifting with a soft clink of metal leaves, and extended his arm. Ceres placed her fingers upon it, her touch lighter than her gaze, which held him for the briefest moment before she turned away from the table's hush and its watchful eyes. They left the hall together, the hush parting like cloth behind them, the eyes of the court following, hungry, hopeful, measuring. The corridors beyond were dimmer, lit only by the flicker of torches in iron brackets and the pale gleam of moonlight spilling through high windows. Neither spoke at first. Their footsteps echoed softly off the old stones, the rhythm of their pace oddly in step, though Edwin felt his pulse beating faster than it should. When they reached the garden doors, Ceres paused, withdrawing her hand to pull her cloak tighter about her shoulders. Edwin opened the door for her, the old iron hinges groaning as they stepped into the night air, crisp and carrying the faint scent of turned earth and cold blossoms. The gardens lay quiet, frost clinging to the edges of hedges and the marble rims of dry fountains. Moonlight spilled like spilled milk over the gravel paths, catching in the tangled branches where the first buds of spring clung stubbornly against the cold. They walked in silence until they reached the heart of the garden, where an old stone bench sat beneath a great yew whose black boughs seemed to drink the moonlight whole. Ceres stopped there, her cloak brushing the frost-bitten grass. "Will you sit?" she asked, though it sounded more like a command than a request. Edwin obeyed, settling onto the cold stone. Ceres remained standing at first, looking down at him with that restless, measuring stare. "You do not wish this," she said, her tone so quiet it might have been the breeze slipping through the yew's needles. He did not pretend. "Do you?" She laughed once, low and sharp, then folded herself beside him, her cloak pooling like a dark tide. "My father is dying," she said, voice unflinching. "His steward hisses fears of Marrow's grain, Marrow's salt, Marrow's ships left to drift aimless without a crown's anchor. So they send me here, to anchor myself to you." Edwin studied her face, the way the moonlight traced the edge of her cheek, the corners of her mouth. "And if you will not be an anchor?" She turned her head, her eyes searching his. "Then I must be a blade instead." For a moment, she seemed about to smile, but it never quite reached her mouth. "Tell me, Prince of Wormwood, are you a stone to be bound to, or something softer that might yet slip free?" He thought of the lavender in his sleeve, its scent pressed close to his heartbeat. He thought of his hidden scraps of parchment, of corridors that spiraled like dreams, of a river he had never seen but knew waited for him all the same. "I don't know yet," he said, truth shaping his voice like a knife in the dark. "But when I do, I suspect you will know before anyone." Her eyes softened then, though only slightly. "Good. I would rather wed a boy with secrets than a crown with none." Above them, the yew branches shivered in a wind that tasted faintly of thaw and wild places far beyond the stone walls. They sat there together, prince and promise, anchor and blade, beneath the hush of moonlight that knew too well how to keep such fragile truths hidden until the dawn. As dawn broke over the mist-laden hills, The royal court at Rosehold stirred with the slow grace of an ancient creature waking from a long dream. In the high towers and stone corridors, footsteps echoed like murmured secrets. It was here, in this labyrinth of cold flagstones and hanging tapestries, that young Prince Everard found himself wandering long before the sun's warmth could reach the frost-bitten windows. Prince Everard, now in his 16th year, was beginning to discover that royalty was far stranger than any fable sung by the fire. He had grown tall, his shoulders filling out the fine velvet tunics sewn by the Queen's tireless seamstresses. Yet inside, he remained the same boy who had once chased cats through the kitchens and hidden beneath the council table to eavesdrop on grave-faced men. But lately, Everard's restless heart could find no comfort in childish mischief. He woke before dawn each day and crept through the castle's silent passages, seeking to understand the peculiar ways of royal life that wrapped around him like ivy, tight, tangled, and impossible to prune away. On this morning, he found himself outside the Hall of Ancestors, a vaulted chamber lined with towering portraits of long-dead kings and queens, each rendered in stiff oils, eyes forever watching, judging, whispering nothing and yet everything. The young prince stepped inside, his breath misting in the cold air, his footsteps soft against the marble floor. He paused before the painting of King Oswin the Stern, whose reign had ended in betrayal and blood, if the scribes were to be believed. Yet here he looked serene, draped in a cloak of ermine and gold, his scepter held like a shepherd's staff rather than a tyrant's rod. Everard wondered what secrets this forefather might share, if paint could speak and canvas could sigh. He imagined the old king's voice echoing in the chamber, telling of dark bargains struck by moonlight, of poisoned goblets and whispered confessions behind arras curtains. But the portraits remained still and mute, offering only the heavy weight of expectation that pressed against the boy's slender chest. As the morning crept onward, Everard's solitude was broken by the arrival of his tutor, Master Isambard, a tall man draped in robes of deep plum, smelling faintly of old parchment and cloves. He found Everard before the portrait and inclined his head in a gesture halfway between deference and weariness. "Your Highness," Isambard said, voice soft but edged with the iron of duty. "Your mother summons you. The Queen would speak before the midday meal." Everard nodded. He followed the old man through the winding corridors, his mind still lingering among the painted ghosts. They passed beneath banners stitched with family crests, past the library where candlelight flickered behind latticed windows, past guards who snapped to attention, but dared not meet the prince's eyes for too long. All the while, Everard wondered what the Queen wished to say, whether it would be another lesson in decorum, another reminder of his bloodline's brittle dignity. When they reached the Queen's solar, Everard paused outside the carved oak door. He drew a breath deep enough to steady the tremor in his hands. Inside, his mother sat in a high-backed chair near the hearth, the firelight painting her face in flickering warmth that softened none of her severity. Queen Adeline had been beautiful once, or so the court poets claimed, but years of governance and intrigue had carved that beauty into something sharper. Her cheekbones high and pale, her eyes like shards of polished slate. She gestured for Everard to sit upon the cushioned stool before her. Wordlessly, he obeyed, folding his hands in his lap as Isambard retreated to the far wall. "Everard," she began, her tone like silk stretched over a blade, "you have grown taller than your father was at your age. A pity you have yet to grow wiser." Everard stiffened, but kept his eyes on the floor, for he knew better than to return his mother's gaze when she was in this mood. "You wander these halls at hours when decent folk sleep," the Queen went on. "You linger in the library, poring over old chronicles when you should be mastering treaties, alliances, the careful art of pleasing nobles whose favor might keep your head upon your shoulders." Everard opened his mouth, but no words came. He knew she would not brook excuses. She leaned forward, the firelight catching in her jeweled circlet. "There is more to a crown than your father ever understood," she said, voice low. "He believed power to be a simple thing, a throne, a sword, a loyal guard at his side. Foolish man. A crown is a nest of vipers, and one must learn not only to wear it, but to feed it, soothe it, and if need be, let it bite another in your stead." The words chilled him more than the dawn air had. He thought again of the Hall of Ancestors, of painted kings who smiled while blood pooled at their feet, hidden beneath layers of silk and oil. He wondered if his mother's portrait, someday, would show her as gentle and serene, though he knew that no one who had ever sat before her fire could believe that lie. "You are to join the council session this afternoon," the Queen commanded. "You will stand beside me as Lord Henrik speaks of the harvest levy. You will listen, you will learn, and you will hold your tongue." Everard nodded. She watched him, her gaze weighing him like a merchant weighs a sack of grain. "When your father was your age, he believed he could change this kingdom with kindness," she murmured almost to herself. "I buried him on a winter's eve so cold the tears froze to my cheeks before they could fall. Do you wish the same fate?" "No, mother," Everard whispered. She leaned back, satisfied, or at least no longer disappointed enough to prolong the scolding. She waved him away with a flick of her pale hand. Outside the solar, the corridor seemed brighter, the tension loosening its iron hold on his spine. Isambard fell in step beside him, silent at first, then spoke in the low, even tone that made the prince feel like a child again. "Your Highness, knowledge is not rebellion. It is armor. Remember that." Everard did not answer. Instead, he turned toward the library once more, for he could not yet bear the thought of the council's cold stone chamber. He wanted, if only for an hour, to slip back into stories of old wars and stranger kings. Kings who had once dared to dream in the shadows of painted portraits, whose weird and winding paths had shaped the life he must now inherit. As he pushed open the library door, the scent of old vellum and beeswax met him like an embrace. He slipped inside and closed the door behind him, the echo of his mother's warnings fading under the rustle of pages waiting to be turned. And though he did not yet know how to change the world, Prince Everard knew he could still dream of it. Strange and royal, terrible and wonderful, all at once. The library at Rosehold was a realm unto itself, a sanctuary built of hushed whispers, the turning of parchment, and the soft sigh of dust drifting through shafts of light. Prince Everard lingered there long after his mother's words had grown stale in his mind, seeking answers between the brittle bindings of chronicles and the careful script of forgotten scribes. He sat by a tall window, the panes rimed with dew that glowed like crystal in the afternoon sun. Before him lay an open tome, its cover cracked with age, its pages filled with the tangled lineage of his house. Marriages sealed with silk and steel, betrayals penned in the margins like footnotes no one dared speak aloud. Each name was both a promise and a curse. He traced them with his fingertip, as if by touching ink he might summon the truth buried beneath royal myths. The door creaked and closed with a soft thud behind him. Everard did not look up at first, thinking it only the chamberlain come to draw the drapes. But the footsteps were lighter, unhurried. When he raised his eyes, he found Lady Sibylla standing before him. Sibylla of the Ashen Hall, whose family lands lay far to the north, where the pine forests breathed secrets into the wind. She was no older than Everard, yet her presence was a curious balm against the chill that clung to Rosehold stones. Her gown was of dark blue wool, plain compared to the silks worn by the courtiers, but her poise made it seem finer than any velvet. Her hair, the color of ripe chestnuts, was bound in a single braid that fell over her shoulder, brushing the silver brooch at her collar. "My lord," she said softly, dipping in a curtsy too graceful to be merely learned. "May I sit?" Everard nodded, shutting the book and pushing it aside as if he'd been caught hoarding a secret. Sibylla settled on the cushioned bench opposite him, folding her hands atop the table. For a moment they simply sat, the silence filled with the far-off rustle of a librarian rearranging scrolls on distant shelves. "You spend much time alone here," Sibylla said, not as an accusation, but an observation, as if she were remarking on the weather. "Do the ancestors speak to you through their dusty pages?" He huffed a quiet laugh, the sound half swallowed by the hush of the library. "If they do, they are clever enough to speak in riddles, or perhaps I am too dull to hear their plain words." Her eyes softened. "You are not dull, Everard, only restless." He studied her then, truly studied her, as he might a strange passage in one of his books. Sibylla was a guest at Rosehold by her father's design, part of a subtle game of alliances that Everard had yet to understand in full. Yet in her company, he felt a different sort of intrigue, one that had nothing to do with treaties or dowries. "And you?" he asked. "Why seek the quiet corners when you could walk the gardens or gossip in the solar?" A fleeting smile touched her lips. "Perhaps I, too, wish to listen to the dead, or perhaps I find the living far more tedious than old ghosts." She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "I hear you will sit at council this afternoon. They say it is your first time." "They say much." He tried to sound indifferent, but his unease betrayed him. "I suppose you have come to tell me what I should say, how I should stand, when I should nod." Sibylla shook her head, the braid swaying like a pendulum of dark silk. "I have come only to say this. When they drone on about bushels and coin, look not to the lords but to the scribes. They are the ones who know how the world truly turns. Lords posture. Scribes remember." Her words startled him more than he wished to show. He thought of Master Isambard's constant warnings, of parchment as armor, of words as daggers hidden in plain sight. Sibylla seemed to read his thoughts as easily as she might a primer. "Do you think me strange?" she asked, not unkindly. "To speak of secrets so openly?" "No," he said after a heartbeat, "only honest. And honesty is rarer here than gold." They fell quiet again, listening to the creak of old shelves, the brush of a quill somewhere deep in the stacks. Everard felt the weight of the council session pressing nearer, a coil of dread tightening in his chest. Yet Sibylla's presence was an anchor in the tide of worry, something solid, if only for a moment. "I should go," he said at last, glancing at the tall clock that ticked with solemn authority near the fireplace. "If I am late, Mother will have my head displayed beside Father's in the Hall of Ancestors." Sibylla's laughter was gentle, like wind through dry leaves. "Then go, Prince Everard. But remember, should the Lord speak in circles, find the straight line hidden beneath. And should you feel your courage failing, imagine them all in their nightshirts, fretting over bedbugs and chamber pots." He rose, her jest conjuring a reluctant smile. As he gathered his cloak from the back of the chair, Sibylla stood as well, her hand brushing his sleeve. A fleeting touch, but it warmed him more than the hearth ever could. With a final nod, Everard stepped from the sanctuary of the library into the dim corridor beyond. The chill met him at once, but he felt it less keenly. He walked with steadier steps toward the council chamber, the echoes of Sibylla's words coiling around him like a hidden charm. Through winding halls he went, past guards in polished breastplates and servants with heads bowed low. Outside the council doors, 2 men-at-arms pushed them open at his approach. A gust of stale air greeted him, heavy with the scent of ink, tallow, and the perfumed rot of old alliances. Inside, the gathered lords rose at his arrival, a forest of gray and gold brocade. His mother sat at the head of the long table, her expression unreadable but her eyes sharp as a hawk's. Everard took his place at her right hand, folding his hands upon the polished oak. He looked not at the ringed fingers drumming upon ledgers, nor at the jeweled collars that gleamed like shackles, but at the scribes, quiet men with quills poised, ink bottles trembling as they recorded every word, every gesture, every sigh. And he wondered if, in their careful lines of script, the true shape of the realm might yet be found, strange, royal, and far more alive than any painted king in a cold stone hall. The council chamber of Rosehold was a place where daylight seldom lingered. Narrow windows, carved deep into stone walls, let in only thin beams that danced across the long oaken table like restless ghosts. The heavy air smelled faintly of old vellum, melting wax, and the perfume that clung to the robes of men who fancied themselves architects of kingdoms. Prince Everard sat still at his mother's right hand, trying to remember Sibylla's advice, to look for the straight line beneath the circle of their words. Yet as Lord Henrik rose and cleared his throat, Everard felt the coil of tension winding about his chest again, for Henrik's voice was like gravel poured slow upon marble. "Your Majesty," Lord Henrik began, bowing stiffly to Queen Adelind before letting his watery eyes drift toward Everard. "And Your Highness, the matter of the harvest levy weighs heavily upon the outlying villages. Reports from the reeves speak of frost-bitten barley, and the southern orchards have fared little better. If we press the full tax this season, the peasants will suffer greatly come winter." A murmur stirred among the lords. Some fingers drummed, some lips pressed thin as blades. Everard could feel the chill of their glances flicking toward him, assessing how the young prince might shift the balance of words not yet spoken. Queen Adeline tilted her chin, her gaze fixed on Henrik like a needle poised above cloth. "And what would you have us do, Lord Henrik?" Her tone was light as falling snow, but there was iron beneath it. Henrik hesitated. His ringed hands fidgeted with the ledger before him. "I would counsel that we reduce the levy by 1/10, enough to ease the burden without starving the coffers. Signed, should spring be kind, we may recover the loss through trade tariffs." A second voice broke in. Lord Athelstan, broader than Henrik and twice as loud, his chain of office rattling when he leaned forward. "If we yield now, your majesty, we embolden the tenants to plead mercy every season. Hunger makes the peasant obedient. Well-fed men grow restless." A few chuckles, low and mean, rippled through the hall. Everard's stomach turned at the ease with which they spoke of lives weighed against grain. He looked down at his folded hands, remembering Sibylla's words, "When they speak in circles, find the straight line." He lifted his gaze. The scribes sat along the walls, heads bowed, quills scratching like tiny knives across parchment. They wrote it all. Henrik's caution, Athelstan's disdain, the queen's measured silence. Their records would outlive every lord in the room. At last, the queen turned to her son, the slightest tilt of her head commanding his voice. "Everard, you have heard their counsel. What say you?" The chamber stilled. The scratch of quills faltered. Everard's pulse thudded in his ears. Yet when he spoke, his voice came steadier than he expected. "If I may, mother." He paused, forcing himself to meet Athelstan's narrowed eyes. "It seems to me that a hungry peasant is no loyal subject. Hunger breeds despair, and despair breeds revolt. My father's chronicles speak of it often. Fields left fallow not by frost but by fire, lit by hands that had nothing left to lose." Athelstan's brows lowered like storm clouds. "The boy reads too many old tales," he sneered. Everard did not flinch. He turned instead to Henrik. "You say the orchards withered and the barley failed. Has no aid been sent from the granaries?" Henrik blinked, caught unprepared. "Some. But to open the royal stores further would." "Would it not buy loyalty?" Everard pressed gently. "If we lighten the levy, send grain to ease the worst hunger, we lose a coin but gain hearts. And come spring, when the fields recover, men will plow for their king instead of sharpening sickles for his throat." Silence. A low, speculative hum stirred around the table. Some regarded the boy prince with faint amusement, others with grudging curiosity. Only Queen Adeline betrayed nothing, save for the faintest tightening of her mouth. Whether displeasure or hidden approval, Everard could not tell. At last she spoke, her voice slicing through the room like a thin blade. "Wise counsel, my son, though youth should temper wisdom with caution." She turned her gaze to the gathered lords. "The levy shall be reduced by 1/10, as Lord Henrik advises. The royal stores shall open at my discretion to ease the worst want. Let this be a reminder that mercy and power are twin blades, sharpened best when wielded together." A rustle of assent, some sincere, some forced. The scribes bent again to their parchment, immortalizing every word. Everard forced himself to sit still, though inside he felt the trembling rush of what he'd done, spoken, been heard, shifted a room that had stood unchanged for decades. As the council turned to new matters, timber rights, toll disputes, rumors of brigands haunting the western roads, Everard let his eyes drift to the high, arched windows. A single beam of late afternoon sun broke through, illuminating the motes of dust that danced in the stale air. They reminded him of snow swirling outside the castle walls, quiet, cold, yet carrying the promise of a softer world beneath the frost. When the final matters were done, the queen rose. Her hand brushed Everard's shoulder, barely a touch, but enough to tell him he had not wholly erred. She swept from the chamber, lords parting like reeds before a river's current. Everard lingered a moment longer, watching the scribes gather their ledgers, their eyes never quite meeting his. In the corridor outside, Master Isambard awaited him, leaning on his cane of polished yew. He said nothing at first, but as they began to walk the long torchlit passage back toward the inner keep, the old tutor's voice came soft and dry as parchment. "You spoke well, Highness. Not perfectly, but well." Everard allowed himself a thin smile. There is time yet for perfection. Isambard's answering chuckle was low and weary. "A crown is never perfect, my prince, nor the head that wears it." They walked on in silence. Beyond the arrow slits, the sky bruised into dusk, and the wind carried the faintest promise of snow. Somewhere behind them, scribes dipped quills into ink pots and pressed fresh pages between covers, binding Everard's words into the slow, relentless heartbeat of the realm. In his heart, the prince felt the first fragile bud of something that might one day grow, strange and rare as any blossom coaxed from winter's iron grasp. Not power? Not yet. But perhaps the seed of something more enduring than the cold stone halls that would one day hold his painted face alongside all the others. That night, long after the final embers in the great hearths of Rosehold had sunk to a soft red glow, Prince Everard lay awake in his chamber beneath the canopy of dark oak beams and faded silken drapes. The flickering flame of a single candle cast tall shadows that danced across the tapestries, woven scenes of battles won, marriages struck, and kings crowned in glittering halls that no longer existed beyond thread and rumor. He should have felt triumphant. He had spoken in council, been heard, and, however slightly, had turned the will of the court like a ship guided from hidden shoals. Yet in the hollow quiet of his room, the taste of that victory felt faint and fleeting. Beyond the thick walls, the wind whispered through arrow slits, carrying with it the scent of the coming frost and the distant howl of wolves hunting in the dark woods. He rose from his bed, bare feet brushing against the rushes strewn across the cold stone floor. His breath misted faintly in the chill. He slipped on a heavy cloak lined with fur, drew it close around his narrow shoulders, and crossed to the tall window that overlooked the inner courtyard. Below, the keep slumbered beneath a dusting of early snow. Lanterns flickered by the gates where the sentries paced, their shadows long and hunched. From the distant stables came the restless stamp of hooves and the low nicker of horses unsettled by the cold. All of it seemed at once so near and so impossibly far away. A quiet knock broke the hush, so soft he almost believed it part of some drifting dream. When he did not answer, the latch turned and the door creaked inward. Lady Sibylla stepped through, wrapped in a cloak of midnight blue. Her braid hung loose tonight, the chestnut strands brushing her throat like ink upon parchment. "Forgive me," she said, her voice a murmur, as if the stones themselves might overhear. "I should not be here at this hour." Everard turned fully to face her, the cold forgotten for a moment. "Yet you are." She gave him a look, half smile, half warning, as if to remind him that truth was a dangerous luxury behind stone walls. She stepped closer, her boots muffled by the rushes. For a long moment, they simply stood in the candle's fragile glow, two young conspirators in a castle too old for their quiet rebellion. "I heard of what you spoke today," Sibylla said at last. "The scribes are swift, and gossip swifter still." Everard gave a soft laugh, one that felt strange on his lips. "And what do they say?" "That you are your father's son," she said, tilting her head, "and that you are your mother's child. Which frightens them more, do you think?" He looked back toward the courtyard, where flakes drifted slowly, catching the lantern light like falling embers. "Perhaps it should frighten me more than it does." Sibylla moved closer until they stood only an arm's length apart. "The court is a maze, Everard. You know this now. They will praise you when it suits them, scorn you when it suits them more. But you spoke of mercy today, and mercy is a strange thing in royal halls. It makes people listen, even when they pretend not to." He felt the warmth of her nearness, an anchor in the drifting fog of doubt that so often threatened to swallow him. "Why does it feel like every word I speak must be barbed or hidden beneath another?" he asked quietly. "Because it must," Sibylla said, her tone tender yet edged with hard truth. "But you are not alone in this. Remember that." She reached out then, the tips of her fingers brushing his wrist, a touch so slight it might have been the passing of a ghost. Yet it steadied him more than any heavy crown or polished blade ever could. They stood like that for a heartbeat longer, caught between the hush of the sleeping keep and the murmur of the winter wind. Everard wondered if somewhere, beyond the snow-choked roads and frost-bitten orchards, there was a place where royalty could shed its velvet skin and breathe free, where a prince might be only a boy and a lady only a girl, and the world not a puzzle of secrets and knives. But that was a dream for another night. Sibylla pulled back, her hand slipping from his wrist. She looked at him, and in her eyes he saw the same strange longing that coiled in his own chest. a hunger for something truer than portraits and parchments and the weight of dead men's crowns. "You should sleep," she said softly. "Tomorrow they will demand more of you." "And you?" he asked, though he knew the answer already. "I will listen," she said, "and remember." She slipped from his chamber then, leaving behind only the faint trace of her warmth and the echo of her words. Everard closed the door gently, leaning his forehead against the carved oak. The candle sputtered in the draught, throwing long shadows across his tired face. He returned to the window once more. Below, the snow fell thicker now, cloaking the courtyard in a quiet so deep it seemed to swallow every secret, every whispered bargain struck in the cold corridors of Rosehold. Somewhere far beneath his feet, the painted faces of the ancestors watched from their hall of silence, unmoving yet ever present, ghosts bound by lineage, by duty, by the strange life that royalty demanded. Prince Everard stood alone in his chamber, yet he did not feel so very alone. He could hear Sibylla's voice as clearly as if she still stood beside him, reminding him that mercy could be sharper than any crown, that words could be a fortress stronger than stone. And though the cold pressed hard against the window panes, within him burned the faintest ember of something warmer, a quiet promise that this strange life, with all its thorns and riddles, might yet be shaped into something worth bearing. Outside, the first true snow of winter fell upon Rosehold, burying the old paths, softening the harsh edges of the kingdom. And in that fragile hush, a prince dreamed not of crowns and portraits, but of a life both weird and wondrous, woven from secrets, softened by mercy, and guarded perhaps by a single honest hand.